everybody. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there were more than 27,910 new COVID cases reported in the U.S. yesterday, with just under 867 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 31,149 cases per day. That's a decrease of 35% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 37% of the American public has been fully vaccinated at this point, including all children, all adults. And 48% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 33 million people across the United States and killed about 586,824 people. The European Union has approved a plan to reopen borders to vaccinated Americans and other international travelers following more than a year of border restrictions, although word has not yet come out on when the change will go into effect and a final formal approval is still needed. The passage of that plan is secure. Those traveling into the EU would need to have taken vaccines which have already been given the green light in that bloc in the EU. The Serum Institute of India, that's the world's largest maker of vaccines, says it does not expect to resume exports until the end of the year. The institute said its priority would be to help India, which is still in the middle of its second and by far steepest wave of coronavirus infections. In France, terraced eating and drinking at bars and restaurants is now reopening, along with cinemas and movie theaters and museums and other non-essential shops easing back into action as the country lightens its COVID policies. The finance minister for France called the opening up a symbolic step in the country's economic recovery. In national political news, the Attorney General of New York has told the Trump Organization that an investigation into his business dealings has moved from a civil to a criminal investigation. They're looking into whether Trump's company defrauded customers by inflating the values of assets. Trump has denied wrongdoing. A House vote is expected today on the creation of a commission to look into the events of January 6th and the response to it. Republicans are divided in that vote. In international news, 293 people have now been killed in total as the ongoing violent conflict between Israel and Gaza enters its 10th day. Israel said it tried to kill the military chief of Hamas, Mohammed Deif, several times yesterday. Rumors of an incipient truce are now being denied as some neighboring countries push for a quick and peaceful resolution to the crisis. Lebanon's foreign minister has asked to be fired following comments earlier this week that Gulf countries had encouraged the rise of the Islamic State. His comments there angered many of the Gulf states. The International Olympic Committee and Japanese officials have insisted that the Summer Olympic Games will go ahead despite the ongoing pandemic. Good news for sports lovers out there. And more than 70 people are still missing after a cyclone battered the west coast of India this week, tearing through an offshore oil rig off the coast of Mumbai and drowning an accommodation barge with 260 people on board. And with that, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So I want to go back to pretty early in the headlines, actually. There are many things worth talking about here. But the EU, the European Union, approving initially a plan to let outside travelers who've been vaccinated, including Americans, to let them come back in. That came out pretty recently. Yeah. They still need to actually approve it, and there's no specific word on when that will be happening, when people would be allowed to travel back into the EU. But that would be great. That would be a big, big, big step in reopening from an American touristy kind of perspective,
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, at the moment we have 5,000 people dying a day, then you can kind of understand why they would close off things to America. It's also weird, though, for that to happen in the first place. I mean, you wouldn't think of America being shut down like that, like on a normal circle. I know it sounds strange. Like if you're in another country, it doesn't necessarily seem this way, but almost, and this is, arrogant on some level, so I accept that, but it's almost like it's a birthright to be able to go pretty much anywhere with an American visa. Meaning if I have an American passport, I can pretty much go anywhere. It's very few places that are limited for your ability to go somewhere. So for Europe, somewhere that's supposed to be an ally, that's a neighbor, to be like, no, you can't come here. It's a jarring experience. It's a very weird and heady experience.
It is.
Especially when you get to the reason of why. It's the why. And it's like, well, yeah, guys, you guys dropped the ball. in regards to the number of people that were getting sick or the number of people that look, India has what, 1.3 billion people. They have what, 3,000 people dying a day. They still haven't hit our highs. Like, to put that in perspective, like, as bad as India is.
Well, as far as we know, the numbers that we were saying this pretty regularly.
They get the crematoriums and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The numbers could be a bit higher. Now, that doesn't do everything to your point, because on a per capita basis, the U.S. would still be way above India.
Yeah,
which is obscene. But
yeah.
on the other hand,
it's like the idea that they shut us out. But
yeah, our response has been mixed and weird. And I actually wanted to get back to the EU travel thing, but our response has been mixed and weird because on the one hand, the United States, like you were saying, was the epicenter for a long time, had unprecedented deaths, still leads the world, as far as I know, in a number of deaths. And at the same time, the vaccine rollout has gone pretty well for a nation of our size. If you look around the other parts of the world that have done the development stuff, we're well into the administration process. We've got multiple contenders, leasing them out in some cases for export and outside use, that kind of thing. So my point is, there have been ups and downs in the U.S.'s handling of this stuff, but when it comes to travel, what made it a little bit more normal feeling was that Trump was threatening, of course, the exact same move very early on during the coronavirus. Right. If you remember, before everything went topsy-turvy in the time before time, remember when it was Republicans that were being very cautious of the coronavirus, and it was Democrats who were calling that caution racism and stuff very early on? I'm talking about like February, March, I believe it would have been, early March. When it first started. Remember, like, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats down in San Francisco celebrating, I forget what it was, but Asian holiday in Chinatown or something like that, while the coronavirus is going on. Trump is criticizing them for that. That's semi-justifiably being called racist criticism. Because
he's going after China.
He's going after China. But at the same time, he's going after them because they're not taking they're not taking it seriously enough. Now, the fact that they're in Chinatown, in my opinion, is basically irrelevant. It's not like they're going to, as far as I can tell, there wouldn't be a disproportionate number of cases coming from there necessarily.
Yeah.
But
right. There was nothing genetic about the virus.
My point was back pretty early on in the course of things, before it really hit in the States, it was the Democrats who are less cautious and the Republicans who are more cautious, which it's switched to the other way around now, where Republicans are anti-mask and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a weird thing before. It's easy to forget. But yeah, if we can travel to the EU again, that'd be cool.
That would be very cool. That would be very, very cool. Loved Europe. And, like I said, it's very bizarre for them to shut us down like that. But you can understand why they would shut us down that.
And we did shut them out too.
Yeah, right. We shut them out too. But at the point where we became epicenter, became kind of, null and void. The European thing is strange to me, just because of the politics of the stuff getting back in line with Joe Biden as opposed to Donald Trump, the antagonism that was there with Trump as opposed to Biden. And the way that they just love them some Biden now. I mean, even the conservative government in something like the UK was more akin to, let's say, a Democratic presidency than a Republican presidency. And so, yeah, I mean, the catch becomes, what does this mean now? Now that the stuff is supposedly opening back up, what does it mean? And now that Americans can travel back to the UK or to Europe, I mean, that's assuming that they have COVID shots.
Yes.
And then that even gets to, how do you know? Like, we're talking about the COVID restrictions here. Like, they're basically saying, if you get your COVID shots, you can go into wherever. And they're doing that purely for the politics of it. This is not, let's be very clear, this is not a medical choice. This is a political choice.
What are you talking about?
Well, this notion that, hey, if you get your shots, you can go into buildings. You don't need your mask. You don't need, to wear your protective requirements and stuff like that if you're vaccinated in the U.S. And that's the argument that they're going with now in the various stores and stuff like that. And I guess that sounds good, but how do you know?
Well, yeah, you'd have to have your vaccine passport. I'm sure Amazon could come up with
a
way to do this.
With and so forth.
That kind of thing. You have a bag, and on the outside is a QR code that the Amazon camera that's in store can always read.
And as you walk by, you can see the cops running through the airport, tackling somebody like OJ because they didn't have their vaccine and badge as they walk through.
Well, but the vaccine passport is how you would handle this stuff internationally. And for me, I got the first vaccine. I lost the thing that they were filling out. I found it later. But when I went in to go get my second shot, they just refilled out my vaccine thing, and then they were handed it to me.
They never gave it. I mean,
if you asked the hospital, they said, or at least at my hospital, they said they would give it to me. So I would just ask them.
I guess they would give you one if they needed one.
Exactly.
I guess at the clinic they were just giving people shots if they needed the shots.
Yeah, and then the idea is you have some sort of physical thing with their contact info, of course, that you can hand off to an authority when you want to go to get
prove
an actual vaccine passport, which different companies are providing, and it seems like there are competing services for a while. It'd be good to do an update on vaccine passports, of course.
Yeah, I thought that was something that people were leery of. That they were very, very leery of.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a controversial conversation. But,
to put him, that's the thing associated with that.
Well, but I mean, the thing is I guess what people could be extra worried about is, it's collusion, or it's a government and a private agency, private company working together to share my data. Ooh, but I mean, if you have a passport, isn't all that stuff already in there? I mean,
kind of that way already.
I guess it's the medical records being linked up to it, and this weird sense of personal invasion.
Yeah. But is it that, or the feeling that you're forced to get something to either go somewhere, to enter somewhere, participate?
I felt like it was the problem people have with it is the privacy thing, or something about the privacy. Exactly. Yeah. Because, I have to get a pass to be able to travel now.
Yeah.
Well, screw you.
You have to do that anyway.
Yeah, it's not onerous at all. You already have to get a passport.
I mean, the thing is, your information is already shared. Like if you think of, like, if I go onto Facebook, or if you register to get a marijuana card, you have to register for that. You have to sign up for that.
Yeah.
So I don't see, I don't see the privacy thing doesn't bother me too much.
What
it was
gets
more
a
along
little
the lines of the barring people from going from point A to point B.
Yeah, and that's if and then there's the slippery slope argument, which is legitimate in its own way, where that's for travel between countries. But in New York, they have these vaccine passports that it seems they're set to require for entry to everything from baseball stadiums, potentially to bars on the way down. And so if the cost for engaging in public life again on the other side of this pandemic is to give up your privacy, in this ever increasing demand for more information about you, your whereabouts, everything about you, and now tying your medical records into it. I can see how for the quotidian, for the day-to-day, for mundane, just daily life stuff, having to show a passport all the time, that starts to feel very weird. And that's an ongoing conversation in New York right now. I was talking about the Excelsior Pass on the show within the last couple of months. They're pushing for it. Cuomo right now.
Oh, man, very interesting. I don't know. I mean, the vaccine thing is a little weird because they're saying basically that you can go into buildings, but I haven't heard them ask people for cards. Like, have you heard them say, "Hey, we need to see your card"?
No, that's the thing. How do you verify it?
Yeah, how do you verify it? Well, and do they care?
I don't know.
It seems like they may not even care at this point. They want to incentivize people to get the shot.
If up the lack of privacy, Jamarl. If they're going to do it, they should just have cameras watching us all the time and tracking us.
They already do have
QR
cameras
codes.
watching you all the time, Shay.
Oh, don't spoil the plot. But the other side of this conversation, though, of course, is that this is all this tracking, this lack of privacy. Isn't this if you look at a couple of the East Asian countries that responded fairly successfully to the coronavirus and tamping it down very early, isn't this exactly the level of invasion you would expect and require in order to get that level of tamping down? So say, 14, 15 months ago, we were finding out and first responding to on a large scale this crisis. What if we had upped the ante and eradicated all privacy, but also successfully knocked out the spread of COVID and saved down, 580,000 lives? Getting closer to 600,000 lives at this point.
Yeah.
Would that have been worth it?
Oh, man. I mean, that gets up to that argument of, like, if you could eliminate, you eliminate all privacy, but you eliminate 90% of crime, would it be worth it? That type of stuff, those type of questions. Look, it's this kind of juxtaposition of the things that you give off versus the things that you get. And you'll have some countries, let's say like China, that's more authoritarian in the way that they organize, that can say, okay, we're not going to do this. And you will get the results that you want.
Yeah.
By the same token, it's still an authoritarian country that can pull that off. It's like countries have advantages and disadvantages. There's certain things, like you could say, you will be more free to go about your way. By the same token, you also will go without healthcare. It's those balances that people, trade off and everything else, where one doesn't necessarily have the absolute dominant. Like, meaning, I can't take a position that is going to cover me in all situations. It just doesn't work that way. And so there's some things that they're better and we excel at. In that very specific situation, that was something that China definitely excelled at.
It's true.
Yeah. I mean, because and honestly, I know I've said this before, but if Donald Trump would have just said, wearing a mask is manly. He only thing he had to do was say it. Wearing a mask gets us back to work. Wearing a mask is, the capitalist position to take, or whatever you need to say for the politics of it. But he would have had a far better chance of winning the election. He would have had a far better chance of not needing the mail-in ballots. I mean, keep in mind, the argument for mail-in ballots basically boiled down to COVID is all over the place. COVID is in people's veins and bodies. And if we let those people go to the polling booths, COVID will spread exponentially more. And so we have to let people send those things off in the mail. That was the argument. The argument goes away on some level the moment that you get rid of the COVID part. Donald Trump screwed himself over on that. I mean, whether it was that, whether it was the business stuff, meaning the economy takes a hit. I mean, many of the actions that he took with the idea of, quote unquote, preserving economic output.
Yeah.
Killed economic.
In the way that Trump had the ability to step economically to the left and get around the wrath that would usually, result either from the Republican leadership or the base. Trump, because he has such popular support, in the same way that he can step weirdly to the left instead of sort of bring the Republican Party in that direction, he could do the same thing with the COVID response.
Yes,
if you look at a lot of the pushback against Democrats, that comes from Trump's pushback against Democrats. He could have paved his own way and made his own response. And so I think I wouldn't even. The mail-in ballots thing gets a little bit more complicated, but just if he had handled it better, there'd be more reason to support him on it. We got to go to a break though, so that you can come back with the soapbox segment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute in our soapbox segment with Jamarl's monologue and a short conversation. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. There's a conversation right now about a January 6th commission. The January 6th commission, or January 6th, of course, is when the putsch attempt took place, or as I call it, a putsch attempt, and as many people consider it a putsch attempt, where basically Donald Trump goes out, he gives a speech. You have people who are marching from that speech to the Capitol. You have policemen who didn't necessarily have weapons and who are basically engaged in fisticuffs with Trumpers who are screaming, Trump, 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 as they try to hold off a large, massive crowd, massive protesters going to the Capitol, screaming, stop the steal. Now, this was an astonishing event. It is true that we had protests going all over the course of last year, and that we were seeing things like a police station being set on fire, something I've never seen in the United States. We were seeing, towns and cities being balkanized, or for that matter, people being in these kind of battles with cops and whatnot. Those were things that we were seeing over the course of the last year during the course of the Black Lives Matter protests with George Floyd being murdered. By the same token, seeing the Capitol assaulted, seeing Congress members rushing away, running for their dear lives, screaming in terror trying to get away from the mob that wants to seek grievances with their Congress members. You have some Republicans who are making the argument that they were just tourists. And the funny part is the guy who said they were just tourists has an image of himself screaming, terrified, etched in mortality in the picture. Almost looks like a painting where he's trying to run away terrified. But from his standpoint and recollection now, they're just tourists. There's a question about, shouldn't your country want to know how that happened? If we indeed wanted to get to the bottom of quote unquote Russiagate, and if we indeed wanted to get to the bottom of Donald Trump supposedly working in the Ukraine in order to get information in order to attack Joe Biden, should we also want to get to the bottom of this? Shouldn't this also be something of interest? If there was the Benghazi investigations, why on earth should we not want to investigate something that was traumatic? I mean, for God's sake, we had barbed wire, we had cops, we had military for like 10,000, 30,000. Shane was deriding these guys for all of the military that was here, that was moseying around. I think he called it a martial law or something to that effect immediately after. Shouldn't we know why all of that came about? And there's an interesting question as to why some of the members of Congress don't want to know. More interesting and more disturbing. I could see from a political standpoint why they wouldn't want to engage with that. If you were part of the Republican Party and the party that was being castigated as being responsible for this riot, for helping to push forward an attack on the capitalism, I could kind of see why you don't necessarily want to be involved in that. But there's something a little bit more deeper here. If you're listening to Lindsey Graham, well, Lindsey Graham basically says, no, I agree that that Joe Biden won the election. Okay, but why are you on the in crowd? Why is it that if the only difference between you and, let's say, Liz Cheney, what is the difference between you two? Cheney voted with Trump like 90-something% of the time. So why is she on the outs, but you're on the in crowd? And I think that gets to the kind of root of this. Despite them saying that, yes, we accept the election, yes, Joe Biden is president, there's still this vague whiff, this vague hint that a large contingent of the party basically, either for the politics of it, for the support, either not wanting to be attacked, have this association with Trump, and not just with Trump from a political or from a party or policy standpoint, but from this aspect of our politics that basically insist, whether it's overtly or whether it's implicit, that Biden somehow is false, that he somehow didn't win, and that Trump somehow, despite not being president, didn't. It's very weird. It's very strange. It wouldn't be weird if it was a fringe party, if it was some kind of fringe group, the Oath Keepers, and they were on the far, far right. But that's not what's taking place. This is the mainstay of the Republican Party that is basically lined up with this particular mindset. It is very strange. They didn't need to do this. They could have came back and said, you know what, we want to get to the bottom of this. We're separating ourselves from this. We're creating a deviation from ourselves. And yes, Biden is president. Yes, we're going to fight Biden. Yes, we're going to put out our policy to give opposition to Joe Biden on this front. That's not what's happening. They do see that the mood in the country is changing. They do see that the tide is changing, and they are on some level, at the very least rhetorically, changing to accommodate it in the same way that Democrats are at the very least rhetorically changing to accommodate it. But what they're changing to is my concern. And it's not even what they're changing to, it's what they're organizing themselves around. And the January 6th and the pushing back and the not being willing to have an investigation into the origins of that is basically hitting at the exact same point. All of these things bespeak of the same issue, whether it's the getting rid of Cheney, who I don't necessarily have that great feelings about, but it's more so the reason that they got rid of the matters more than anything else, whether it's the allegiance to Trump, the carrying the gold statue. All of these things bespeak of this kind of idol worship where these guys believe that they can't compete under normal circumstances and now feel like they need to put their lot in with Trump. From a policy point, I have no issue with that. But what it means in the context of whether or not an individual won, what it means, even on whether or not they accept the results of the election, are greatly disconcerting. Shane, what are your thoughts? I mean, and I guess this is in two questions. Do you think they should have the January 6th thing? Meaning, should they look into it? Or, doesn't matter, shouldn't, it's not that big of a deal one way or the other, and they need to move on. How do you see the January 6th thing? I think there should be an investigation just because, something happened. We're saying that it was a massive deal in our politics, and if it's something that happened, it was a massive deal, I think we should investigate it. By the same token, is this just the politics of it, and it doesn't really matter because it's just the theatrics of it? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, a lot of it I can't tell because we don't know what would come out of it. So a lot of what we would talk about, assuming this happens, is just releases and discoveries as the investigation goes forward. And clearly, I don't know what there is to say about that, so I can't talk about it. Whereof thou cannot speak, thereof thou must remain silent. Anyway, generally, I think that I'll put it like this: start with Trump's administration, because this seems like, as everybody's called it, is an escalation in the history of American politics. But it's also in its own way proportional to the last year plus. In their own weird way, the January 6th breach of the Capitol was a kind of call and response to the Black Lives Matter protest and the level of civic engagement across the board. I'm not saying that there's anything proportional or that they're fighting for the same goals, or that they're comparable in a deeper moral way. But I'm saying, in terms of civil unrest, the idea of people being out in the streets and sort of unprecedented feeling,
like one incentivizes
civil
another,
action,
by like setting a standard or something that's allowed and that type of thing.
If you're on the right and you see the left getting occasionally positive press coverage for large-scale civic action in a way that seems, pretty big to you,
makes it stretches the range of what's norm of sorts, if that makes sense.
Exactly. So that's part of the mechanics of the situation. Now, the other part of it is how singular and unprecedented in several ways Trump's presidency was as well, where Trump, I would say the most criticized president in living history, I think. If you look now, whether that's justified by who he is and what he did is clearly a matter for debate, but I don't think it is entirely. I think that a lot of the pushback against Trump is really because in a couple of foundational and crucial ways, he did criticize and go up against the establishment, specifically, of course, with the foreign policy, where he was wanting to lessen foreign intervention. Obviously, that's going to be a big sticking point. It doesn't even need to be said, but, worth repeating occasionally. So taking all that into account, the unprecedented nature of Trump's presidency and the ongoing, the year plus of civil unrest in the states, this kind of thing in its own way could be predictable. Now, I didn't predict it, clearly, but what that means is, that there's a sort of proportional history to it that it's good to understand and to keep in mind when we're talking about it, and that should set up any conversation and thought process I think that we have about like how we respond to it. Yes, the commission should go forward. I look forward to seeing what it finds, and I look forward to any of the tidbits that come out. Sadly, a lot of them will probably be fake or not totally backed up, and will prove to be bunk just because
Donald
that's how
Trump was eating corn chips.
Exactly, because that's how so much of this stuff goes. And I guess what I'm worried about, of course, is that it escalates. What Trump will undoubtedly do with this is use it as just yet another extension of the long-term witch hunt against him, driven by Democrats at every step. And in some sense, he's 100% right about that. And depending on what they find, Democrats will probably use this to the best of their abilities to weaken Trump and potentially get him imprisoned or disqualified from becoming president again.
That's the interesting part, the prison part, like the New York thing. I mean, because like you said, you read the headline this morning that they were escalating the charges. Basically, they're trying to put him in prison. That would be very weird for us in this country to do that. That gets into the banana republic stuff. Whether or not we're going to put a president in prison and that type of stuff. That is very strange for us to do in this country, especially when it comes across as overtly political, which, whether Trump is guilty or not, is secondary to the point that it's selective in the way that it seems to be done. And look, there's a secondary question of whether it needs to be prison. I mean, if Trump is just convicted, would that be enough to keep him from going running for president again.
Yeah.
And, it could just be, okay, you look, agree to this conviction. No, it's not jail time, but it's enough to keep you from running again. It could be something even to that level.
Yeah.
Let's do this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back with one of my favorite guests, Mark Frost. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by our guest, Mark Frost, entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Shimpetarian, and recovering libertarian. Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. I was enjoying your YouTube, and I just realized there's about a 30-second lag between the actual broadcast and the YouTube version. But yeah, it was a great segment right before this.
Hey, thank you. There absolutely is 100%. But no, thank you for watching that. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to. There's a bunch of stuff we could talk about, but I remember at one point, and I feel like it would be an interesting conversation if you took it in a direction. Remember at one point talking with you about Ibn Khaldun, the Muqaddimah. Did we ever talk about that, Mark? Do you remember him ever coming up? Do you know him?
I don't believe we did.
Do you know who I'm talking about, Ibn Khaldun?
No.
Oh, okay.
That's why I don't think we did.
There we go. Let's not get into it then, because it ties into Joseph Schumpeter in this direction. I guess I could take it in that direction. Ibn Khaldun is this influential 1400s, 15th century Islamic social scientist and philosopher, practically the first social scientist. Again, in the late 1300s, early 1400s, we're talking about here, who had this book called The Introduction, would be the translation in English, or the Muqaddimah. This idea, basically, of sort of cyclical renewal of societies, civilizations, political powers, whatever. And it kind of resembles Joseph Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction, which I know you're a big fan of. With Ibn Khaldun, it is you have civilizations that sort of, come into being, they rise, they decline. And how they come into being is by existing on the fringes, the declining fringes of existing civilizations, and sort of rising and taking control and taking over them. And then over time, they sort of lose their potency, they get weaker, and the same process repeats cyclically with civilizations rising and taking over the weak spots of the preceding civilizations. Now, that's the same thing in its own weird way as creative destruction. If you add technology and you think about businesses or any entity, you have creative destruction as, existing monopolies or existing power structures that are implemented by some certain technological makeup are displaced by new technologies invented by people, insurgents in the economic arena, who come in and take over. Now, I wonder, and I've wondered to myself before, how this could apply to politics. What lessons you could learn if you combine these ideas and added in a few more, I guess, and tried to apply them to the political thought process. In other words, if I wanted to make a better political system, and if you wanted to have some genuine insurgency, and if it weren't just a revolution, but if it were a sort of fundamental reform, improvement, semi-revolution thing, where you're making things better by technologically displacing and outmoding what exists, how do you do that? And does economics have a perspective on that? Mark, I hope that made sense. What's your take?
Yes, it does. I think economics has a perspective on just about everything, because everything, almost, if not literally everything, has an economic component to it. When you define economics as the study of opportunity cost, what are you willing to give up to get something else? We have government, and even people that maybe are distrustful of government, most people think it out and decide it's better to be governed and even have some mistakes made along the way than to live in anarchy, than to just have mob rule. So those sorts of trade-offs are, by definition, economic. It's important to remember that Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction, it often gets misquoted in the press. He coined that phrase specifically to explain business cycles, the roller coaster of boom and bust that capitalist economies historically have suffered from. Indeed, that was the main selling points of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, was that the Fed would stop the boom-bust cycle of capitalism. And so creative destruction just simply is a concept that says as innovation comes, it displaces other ways of doing things. And those other ways of doing things also have a cultural component that societies may or may not value. And some people get left behind. That's what he meant by creative destruction. It has to be considered within the context of the business cycle. So you have periods of great, technological innovation, business innovation, ways of doing things, and all of a sudden you have low unemployment, everything's booming, and then suddenly that boom tapers off, and now you have the opposite phenomena. Instead of everything going up, everything starts going down. And that's the full context of what he meant by creative destruction. Schumpeter was, in many ways, way ahead of his time. He was saying these things at a time when, many people would have argued very much against him. Keynes certainly didn't see, his way. On the other side of the coin, my favorite soapbox is this unemployment thing. And it's a similar thing. I mean, you guys have had me on a lot, and I don't think you've ever seen me get mad or very emotional on most issues. I try to look at it, somewhat detached. But I'm still shocked that these states are throwing the lowest performing level of the working poor under the bus.
Oh, yes.
It's driving me literally insane. I don't sleep well at night over it because this is the doom of capitalism. If this is the kind of capitalism that our leaders want to have.
Well, it's very bizarre.
There's no economic justification for this at all.
Well, this is very bizarre, right? Because they are basically making this argument that, hey, we can't get people to work. Is it possible that the price point that you're trying to get them to work at is just not high enough? It's like, hey, we can't get these people to work for $8 an hour. Maybe we need to give sign-on bonuses. And it's like, maybe they're not paid because from the capitalistic argument, it would just be, well, they're not making enough to get them to work. That would be the capitalistic argument, that you just need to pay them more so you can get them at the business. I mean, I guess there's two questions from this. What's the difference? Why, meaning when all of these jobs got shuffled around, at some point, the people were being exploited with these low wages in the first place. So now that they're trying to get them to, I guess, come back to work, I don't think they dropped the wage, or did they drop the wage? I mean, it's basically why the difficulty? I mean, and I know just as a blunt way, well, you need to pay the people more. I know that part, but why is there a problem with this at all? I mean, did they change the prices? Did they drop the amount that they were paying people before? Are people just not willing to accept getting paid what they were being paid before all of the stuff shuffled? What happened in the intervening time period to create a problem here?
I think part of what has happened on the supply side of labor, workers are the supply of labor. So, just look at any situation. Talk to anybody that generally believes in so-called free markets, and if the wage goes down, they're going to say that is the market wage. If the programmer average wage goes from $100 an hour to $50 an hour, they say that's capitalism. That's business cycles. There's just a surplus of labor right now because we have high unemployment, and so we don't have to pay as high a wages. Well, okay, we have the opposite problem right now. We we have insufficient individuals who are willing and able to exchange their time for money wages at the particular low-end wage at that classification of work. I think a lot of service industry minimum wage type folks had a year off and they did some soul searching. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you don't have a brain. It doesn't mean you don't think in terms of upward mobility for yourself. And maybe they got a taste. Maybe they started doing DoorDash or something. Maybe they started doing other things that that compensated for them. Or, like a lot of people did, maybe they decided the lifestyle they were trying to fuel, maybe they changed their priorities. I don't think anyone knows exactly what's in the mind of the entire national worker pool. But one thing is for sure, $300 only will impact the psychology of the lowest end of the labor pool. This whole concept doesn't even apply to the vast majority of workers. It applies to our most vulnerable people that are unskilled, generally speaking. They are commodities in the service industry space, and we're in a pandemic. I just got my second shot yesterday. There has to be other people that had trouble getting the appointments, that sort of a thing. And to have these states use the lowest end of our workforce as pawns in their political game, it enrages me. Because that's the sort of capitalism that an Albert Speer would advocate, not the kind of capitalism that a Joseph Schumpeter would advocate.
Basically, what the Nazis would advocate, Albert Speer. I'm curious. So how would a free market system deal with that? I mean, there's a certain number of people in the population that are not, because basically this is a game, right? And within the context of this game space, the only difference is your needs are being put on the marquee. Meaning, this is not like, okay, we're playing a game and at the end of this game, I just lose and I just go home. It's, well, if I lose this game, I no longer have the ability to feed myself, or I no longer have the ability to, have somewhere to stay or stay safely. I'm going to get hit over the head as I walk home at night. So how is a free market system supposed to deal with the number of people in the society that either don't have the capacity to, let's say, do jobs beyond basic labor, and even the group of the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands that can't even do unskilled labor? Like, how does that society supposed to deal with that group of people? I mean, because in the COVID, I would imagine that's much more, an issue.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that first of all, we don't have a free market. We regulate markets ad nauseum. But in a free market, what re-equilibrates shortages and surpluses is the price of things. If there's a bad green bean harvest, and okay, that means the price of green beans are going to go up. Well, that also means as the price of green beans go up, people are going to reevaluate and say, you know what? I'm not going to buy green beans this month. I'm going to buy corn. Well, that raises the price of corn because it increases the demand for corn, and over time it decreases the demand for green beans, so everything gets re-equilibrated. The key to this is that the prices are free to re-equilibrate. I was really happy to read in the news that Bank of America just announced they have a minimum wage. Nobody at their company will make less than $25 an hour. That's how they dealt with it. They're like, wow, we can't get tellers to come back to work. They're the low end of banking. That's the people who get exploited the most, you might say. They're the ones who, for which the value of their marginal product gets sold at a higher relative percentage than, say, a crackerjack programmer that they depend on just as much as that that crackerjack programmer depends on his paycheck. So they can't exploit him as much because he has other opportunities. So Bank of America fixed it by just saying, okay, we're going to break out our checkbook and we're going to pay people more. Now, paying people more means you're going to get better people relative to the other folks. I did the same thing in my own company. I raised the wage I pay our lowest people by $10 an hour. I don't have any problem getting people to work. The problem we have here is there is this expectation that there should be this permanent underclass of serfs. One of my favorite economists, Friedrich von Hayek, wrote a book called that, The Road to Serfdom. And these politicians seem to believe they have a right to low-price labor. And it's insane to me, morally, and then even to add, salt into the injury, they justify it in this bogus, nonsensical economic science that isn't economic science. It's just not. That's not how markets re-equilibrate themselves.
Which science are you talking about specifically there, Mark? What are you talking about?
If you go take an economics 101 class, certainly if you take mine, you're going to learn about supply and demand. You're going to learn that supply is a measure of the willingness and ability of producers to supply particular goods over at particular prices over a particular period of time. And similar definition with demand, that sort of a thing. And what makes the labor market special is the suppliers in the labor market, unlike the goods market, are workers. And just like workers have to suffer low wages when there's when it's sort of a buyer's market for companies, well, right now it's a seller's market in the labor market. That means
I hear you. No, I hear you. I hear you on that. No, I hear you on that specifically.
Than they otherwise could.
Yes, totally. No, that's the whole point that you're making effectively. But I guess I feel like what's being left out of this conversation is from the state side, looking at it from the spear perspective for a moment. I guess what they see is businesses not being able to get workers in sufficient quantities to work for them and to get a paycheck, because the state is effectively subsidizing people through these unemployment benefits. And I don't feel like we've made that case explicitly here.
They're not.
But yeah,
they are not subsidizing people. They're being compensated because their original jobs were shut down. These are the people whose jobs were basically shut down because they didn't need as many people. They closed the restaurants. They did this. There was a lot. So this is a government-induced shutdown, and they were limited as to what they were able to do. I look at this as compensation, not subsidy. And again, it should not be the government's job to create a permanent underclass of low-skilled, low-wage laborers so that businesses can have higher than normal profits during a pandemic. I don't see any justification for that. And just like Bank of America proved, they're not having any problem getting people to work for them.
Well, so I authentically agree with you.
Now they want to be a teller.
Mark, I authentically agree with you, but for the sake of adding spice to the stew or whatever, I'm going to play devil's advocate and continue to disagree in my own way, which is, wouldn't our economy, we're doing some fairly complicated from my perspective, not really that complicated, but between the massive amount of money we're putting into things, where that money is going, and the need to get the economy back up and running, all in unprecedented times and with an uncertain technological future. Nobody knows what cities are going to look like in a year or two when we ostensibly are getting fully back into swing. Anyway, with all this stuff happening, we could have problems, and we're almost certainly going to. But for politicians looking to get things going back fully, from their perspective, businesses need to have workers effectively. And if the government is itself giving people the ability to stay relatively flush in their own extremely limited way and at home, doesn't government have a sort of prerogative and a need to stimulate the economy, to get people back to work, to get the economy back up and the sort of, juices running again? Isn't that what politicians should be doing here? Because if they don't, the idea is, you're not going to have things nearly as full in swing as they could be, which isn't frankly going to be better for people, even if people are getting paychecks as compensation for all this stuff. Mark, what's your take?
Yes, government absolutely should try to stimulate all of the things about our economy. but they should not do it on the backs of the lowest rung of the working poor. There's a lot of people who have succeeded in this. If I was king during this, I would have said, okay, we need to make a special assessment. And we're going to make a special assessment so we can pay for these things that make a country a country. What makes a country? There's shared values. Yeah, there's lots of things we all disagree on, but there's a general set of shared values that we hold. And those shared values should result in saying to ourselves, okay, maybe government has been part of the suppression of wages for too long, and it took an exogenous shock like a pandemic to expose that. The smart businesses have recognized this. They see there's a golden opportunity to get the cream of that lower rung. Again, just because you're in the lower rung doesn't mean you're not smart. It doesn't mean you don't have capabilities. It probably means up to the point, at that point in their life, they haven't had the educational and the experiential time that allows them to develop a marketable skill that's not commodified. And what I see happening, instead of calling it unemployment, I would just give the people the $300 and say, you know what? We've had a pandemic. People are suffering. A tiny small percent will abuse this. But we want people to be able to go hunt for a job and not have to take the first job that's offered to them.
Yes.
Now, I don't have that problem. If I'm out of work tomorrow, I can go market myself and I can have a nice income. But just because some people have prospered throughout this doesn't mean we ought to suddenly become anarchists and act like we're all in this for ourselves. The reason we have government is for collectivization. There's lots of things we don't do, even though it would be efficient. 50% of all 50% of all Medicare benefits go to people in the last 18 months of their life. Should we just let them die? Of course not. It would be efficient to do that in the big scheme of a utility function, but there's moral concerns and there's what does it mean to be an American? What makes us proud to be an American? Well, one of the things that we ought to be proud of is that we take care of each other to the extent that we reasonably can.
But Mark, is that true? I mean, look, you were a recovery libertarian, and you've said yourself that, part of the reasoning that you're recovering is because some of the things that some of your, let's say, previous ilk wanted were unconscionable to you. Meaning it's not a shared experience, or it's not this kind of united experience in this thing. You have some people who are perfectly fine letting those people die for the last 18 months of their life. And, whether the majority don't want that, that might be true. But this is not a shared experience. Also, the interests of the individual itself in regards to trying to maximize their profit is the thing that keeps down wages, not government telling these people that you shouldn't pay more. Why do you believe that why are you arguing that it's the government that is keeping down wages as opposed to the individual that has an incentive to keep down wages in order to maximize their own pay?
Because if it wasn't government doing it, then these 20 some odd states that have made this decision wouldn't have the policy that they have. They would recognize that the people that suffered the most in this pandemic are the lower rungs of the labor pool. I didn't suffer at all. Most people didn't suffer very much.
Yeah, no, Mark, but in normal circumstances, the government doesn't give money like this. Like, I guess what I'm getting at is why do you, this is a singular event, meaning the COVID thing, where the government is saying, all right, we need to get these people back to work, et cetera. And I agree with you. I don't think the government should be subsidizing companies in a way like this. But I guess what I'm getting at is why do you believe that this singular instance is indicative of standard? Because I'm saying it's not standard. Under normal circumstances, it's not these guys giving money in order to compensate for the wages that the people aren't necessarily getting. I'm saying this is somewhat of a oddity, even though I agree with you, they shouldn't be doing it.
I would probably respond to that, I suppose, with look at the rhetoric by which they're speaking. I have a voice to the politicians. People of means have a voice with those folks. I'm talking about the people that have the lowest paying jobs that exist in the country. And in normal times, we have hot job markets, we have, soft job markets. And when wages fall, most economists say that's a good thing because you'll have higher employment. Except this is a special situation because a lot of the pain that we have during this pandemic was government chosen. Now, whether it should have been chosen or shouldn't have been chosen, that's probably a conversation for another day. But it was chosen, and the weight of these political choices by politicians seeking votes should not be at the expense of the least powerful classification of citizens in this country.
Agreed. Yeah, no, agreed fully on that. But I mean, okay, so here's another way to look at this, which is an increase in wages. Say minimum wages in different states gets pushed up to $12, $13, $14, $15 an hour. An increase of wages and receiving this kind of reimbursement, that could just become is something proportional to match the rise in inflation that we're very likely going to see from those and the many other expenses that our government has had over the past year and will undoubtedly have in the future, depending on the fate of these bills coming out of Congress. But
and inflation is a tax, and inflation hits the lowest rungs as well. They are the ones that actually pay for it because they can't afford to hedge like I can against inflationary processes.
And put money in the stock market, set aside money so that as the value of your money depreciates, you have more of it in different forms that ideally can withstand that sort of withering process. I hear you on that, but it seems like a large part of this conversation too is depending on where the money chooses to invest the money, the billions and trillions of dollars really that it has invested regularly over the past year.
Let's look at that.
But Mark, here's where I'm going with this. Don't they want to put it into the pockets of people who will put that money back in the stock market, and not necessarily in the pockets of people who will simply circulate that? Because if they can put it in, it's not even. It is self-serving, but it's not just self-serving. If they put it in if they put the money effectively directly into the stock market, and the value of stocks go up, the economy seems like it's doing all well. All of the current shareholders that are keeping the sales of this boat relatively steady, and the wind steady too, that goes more or less without turbulence, as far as I can tell, while we're doing that. Once we stop doing that, if you start to circulate money in the economy, really, if you stop putting nearly as much money in the stock market, you might face some serious hard times, and you wouldn't have necessarily an adequate tool to respond to them with. Things would be a lot less turbulent. Where am I going wrong there, Mark?
I would just encourage you to go make a pie chart and look at the relative percentage of what has been appropriated for unemployment help to boost low-income people, and then look at the rest that's been spent and where it's been spent. And in my view, it's upside down. There's a view of supply side, there is a view of supply side economics that basically says stimulate the people who are already rich, make them richer, and it will trickle down in the forms of jobs, benefits, more opportunity for the little guy. Well, that rarely has been true. It just hasn't been. If you're going to have a collectivized wealth, if we're going to have a collectivized welfare state,
I hear the argument, Mark. I'm sorry. We need to close. We're out of time. Mark Frost, entrepreneur, economist. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lids for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, more than 27,910 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with just under 867 new deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 31,149 cases per day, a decrease of 35% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 37% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 48% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 33,024,648 people across the United States and has killed 586,824 people. The European Union approved a plan to reopen borders to vaccinated Americans and other international travelers following more than a year of border restrictions. Although word has not come out about when the change will go into effect and final formal approval is still needed, the passage of the plan is secure. The traveling into EU would need to have taken vaccines, which have already been given the green light in the bloc. The Serum Institute of India, world's largest maker of vaccines, says it does not expect to resume exports until the end of the year. The institute says its priority will be to help India, which is still in the middle of its second and by far steepest wave of coronavirus infections. In France, terraced eating for bars and restaurants are reopening, along with cinemas, movie theaters, museums, and non-essential shops easing back into action as the country lightens its COVID policies. The finance minister calls the opening up symbolic step in the country's economic recovery. The Attorney General of New York has told the Trump Organization that an investigation into his business dealings has moved from civil into a criminal investigation. They're looking into whether its company defrauded customers by inflating the values of assets. Trump has denied wrongdoing. A House vote is expected today on the creation of a commission to look into the events of January 6th and the response to it. Republicans are divided on the vote, with McCarthy being against it. 293 people have been killed total as the ongoing violent conflict between Israel and Gaza enters its 10th day. Israel said it tried to kill the military chief of Hamas, Mohammad Deif, several times yesterday. Rumors of the incipient truce are now being denied as some neighboring countries push for a quick and peaceful resolution to the crisis. Lebanon foreign minister has asked to be fired following comments earlier this week that Gulf countries had encouraged the rise of the Islamic State, angering many of them. The International Olympic Committee and Japanese officials have insisted that the Olympics or the Summer Olympic Games will go ahead despite the ongoing pandemic. And last, more than 70 people are still missing from a cyclone battered the west coast of India this week, tearing through an offshore oil rig off the coast of Mumbai and downing an accommodation barge with 260 people on board. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And what's interesting, more than 70 people are missing on a cyclone battered the west coast of India, tearing an offshore oil rig off the coast of Mumbai and downing an accommodation barge with 206 people on board. Have they been able to find the people or something to that effect? I mean, the people, they're not. I guess what I'm asking is, what are the results of the race?
What happened as a result of the accommodation barge going down?
Well, it says more than 70 are missing, so I suppose that they can't find a contingent of them.
Yeah, a couple dozen bodies have been brought back to the city after the barge sank. I don't know. Accommodation barges in general, it's kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Well, if you think you moor a ship off the coast of the city, you have a couple hundred people sleep on it because it's a pretty big ship.
Is that what that is? Okay.
Yeah, I believe that's what it is. Is the exactly the idea that they, a ship hotel effectively,
Yeah.
where they can stay.
Well, if that crashed, then that's a lot of people that basically potentially died as a result. That's greatly unfortunate. Oh man, that's greatly unfortunate. Yeah, I didn't know about the storm. The storm thing has escaped my radar. The thing that's been on my radar more than anything else has been the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the number of people that has been dying as a result of it. Also, the Trump thing, the Attorney General looking into Donald Trump. We have Letitia James basically, this is a criminal case from here on out. Well, this gets to the whole thing of, well, if you need to stop Trump from running for office again, one of the ways of doing it would be this.
Yes.
If Trump is in jail, Trump can't run for office. Or at the very least, if Trump has a criminal conviction, Trump can't run for office.
Now, what would it mean if they didn't accept the legal case here?
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean? Like if Trump says there's no
grounding for you guys.
Well, he doesn't accept it anyway.
It's a politicized prosecution.
That's his argument.
And what is his base do about it?
That's the catch, and that's the question. I mean, like the fact that they asked the question at all about whether or not they could prevent Trump from being appropriated from Florida and absconded and taken to New York. The fact that they even asked the question,
extradited,
is astonishing. Like, let's think about it. That gets to this whole thing of like opposition leaders, and whether the opposition leader can be pulled from one various aspect of the country, as if the country is broken up into different components. Yeah, all of this goes to this notion of, did Biden win? All of it. Whether it's this question of, hey, can we get Trump and bring him to New York for prosecution? Where the answer is obviously yes. It's still the United States of America. It's like all of this stuff gets to that. And so, these questions have been somewhat problematic, to put it mildly. Even in Arizona, where the Maricopa County clerk is very angry that these guys are going over his head for another recounting of it, basically saying, you guys are saying that I'm not doing my job right. And I think that's the issue here. It's almost like there's this underlying, I don't want to say government, or this underlying sovereign status on top of America in the way that they're looking at it. Like I've always made this argument that many times when political leaders are out there, regardless of the fighting and everything else that they have, the rule set of America is supposed to matter more. If you and I are playing chess and you all of a sudden take your bishop and just kind of, put it at the other end of the board, I'm like, whoa, you're breaking the rules. The rule set of the game is something that both of us basically agree that we are under, regardless of how much we want to win. We could want to win to the degree that Batman wants to catch criminals, but that doesn't necessarily matter if the rule set says you don't win because of the rule, because you lose. Well, the same thing is true in the political space. The difference is, in this case, America is supposed to matter more. The ideals, like, what is, when John F. Kennedy won that race and John Wayne said, I didn't vote for him, but he's my president and I hope he does well. That no longer seems to be the modus operandi. And not just no longer seems to be the modus operandi, to even go further into this notion that the guy didn't win at all, that all of this and everything that has taken place up to this point has been illegitimate. And I get that Trump could say Democrats did the same to him. And on some level, they did. But there is a slight distinction, and maybe this slight distinction matters all, meaning, the small distinction is everything.
Well, the Trump people would say that last summer, I know that you're probably talking about 2016, but the Trump people would say that last summer, you had mobs of people out on the streets rioting, and that if Trump had been reelected, who knows what they would have done? Who knows how they would have acted? And it could have,
Yeah, but they were on the street because cop killed somebody, not because
ostensibly.
Trump
but a lot of the Republicans and even some left wingers said that either the movement was co-opted or it was set up as a color revolution by elements within the U.S. state. And I get it.
People can say whatever they want. I'm talking about the reality of those things.
When a lot of people say something, that starts to matter.
Not necessarily. I mean, people can say whatever they want. I mean, what matters is what's
but it did
true.
Here. Yeah, well, what matters is what's true. But
what matters is what's true.
But what matters is what's false, too. I mean, if a bunch of people think Trump got reelected actually and that Biden didn't win and they march on January 6th into the Capitol, then what matters, even if it's untrue, it still matters.
That's fair.
If a lot of people believe something and act
but
on
it matters in a different way.
Yeah, that's my point. And here's the thing: is whether you're talking about RussiaGate, which was again another attempt by the Democrats to delegitimize Trump's not electability, but his election, which of course resulted in a weird, alternative form through Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine in his first impeachment, the first impeachment of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. But whether you're talking about that, it's been escalating for a little while.
It has been escalating. It was escalating before that. Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. It was bad with Trump. I mean, but it's been bad from president to president to president to president. Yeah. Trump it took it on a whole new level, though. I mean, like, as bad as it was with Obama, I think it was worse with Obama than I had ever seen it. And, this stuff, that I had ever seen, put that in quotes, right? Because people who are older might have been like, well, Bill Clinton was worse, that type of stuff. But Obama was worse than I had ever seen it. Trump was worse than that.
Trump was way worse than that.
It was worse.
I feel like Trump was proportionally worse than any of the other increases in badness among the other presidents over the past, say, a dozen elections. I don't even know.
Trump was bad. Trump was very bad in the way that they responded.
Yeah, it was a serious escalation. And so Trump's escalation is going to be serious, too. And the question is whether the wave crests here, how it breaks, that kind of thing. Because theoretically, if Trump could die. Another Republican could get elected, and then all of a sudden you'd have an entirely different political discourse because you don't have an intensely polarizing figure demarcating one side of it. That could happen.
Potentially.
Doubtful a little bit, but.
So it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, it depends on whether the changes are more consistent. I mean, and there's a few parts. I don't agree that there is any comparison from the standpoint of what happened in January 6th versus protests. I mean, one is a cop kills somebody, there's a response. The other one is, I won this election for real, raid the Capitol.
They're both big protests.
They're both big protests, right. Right. You can say it that way. And I even agree that on some level, the flexibility of one creates a space for the other. Yeah. Meaning the fact that one happens and it had been that entrenched and for that long period of time and that extreme.
It justifies.
Regardless of whether it was morally right, whether it was justified or not. Like, put all this stuff up. Some people say, oh, that's entirely wrong. Whether it was right, wrong, or somewhere in between, it still created a space for it. It's like the Sanders stuff. It's like, what do you think Obamacare was great or not? It created the space for Medicare for all. It creates your space, right? So it's the same thing. But I don't think those things are the same at all. I think those things are greatly different. But yeah, I agree with you. It did create space, if nothing else. But also, just because people say stuff doesn't, also even that part. They could say it's justified. They could say that we did this because of something else. They could say Trump actually really did win this race. They could say all that stuff. But did he? That's the catch. And honestly, and I agree with you on this, the more I think about it, what is wrong also matters. But that matters in like this kind of other weirder, more unfortunate way when you realize this difference between what they're saying versus the reality of it. Like when dude is saying, no, man, they were just tourists. Oh, no, man, that was just, if you didn't know any better, you would have thought it was just a tourist visit. And then you see a picture of that same guy screaming because people have raided the Capitol. And you're like, come on, dog. Are you really going to do that? Are you really going to play that game? They are. And I think that's unfortunate. Like when you see this, what do you think about this? Like because they're basically saying there is no spoon. Like, look, if somebody wants to make an argument to me that what happened on January 6th wasn't that big of a deal. Okay, fair enough. If they want to say that these are people who seek to redress their grievances, okay, fair enough. But you shouldn't have to pretend that it didn't happen in order to make your point.
I'll put it like this.
I'm not saying you do that.
I'm
just saying some people are.
They may be saying there's no spoon, but we're also living in unprecedented times. And so in the same room that they're saying there's no spoon, there's like a smoke grenade that like went off a while back, and there's an active fire in the kitchen. It's an oil fire. It's not a good thing. And you're kind of distracted, and there's a lot of stuff going on, or something like that. Like the ambient baseline environment here is Trump supporters believe that Biden, unjustly overthrew the election, effectively using fraudulent ballots, voter suppression, voter oversight suppression, and other tactics over the course of the election. And the mail-in balloting change, just that alone, is a pretty significant change in how people do vote. So that's unprecedented, but we're going through a pandemic. And so from that perspective, you can kind of explain it away as I do. And therefore, there's, it's like we are already going through a weird time. And so on the one hand, it would be extremely childish, and therefore I'm not actually going to say, can't we all just get along or something like that? Can't we all understand that there's some ambiguity to this, that if we were to investigate it thoroughly and have an open conversation, ideally we could remedy. But we seem to be at the point where we just want to cut each other off at the pass at every turn.
And that's unfortunate.
Whether it's politicians in Congress or people in the street. Now, thankfully, not that many people actually want to kill each other, which is what makes the difference between a civil war and a mere civil conflict.
Yes.
Right now, people seem to be more or less
in a civil conflict. Yeah, man. This has been a weird, let's say, few years, to put it mildly. And I don't know if that's, some people may try to put that on Trump. And I don't think that can entirely be on Trump. Because, look, whatever people want to think about it, they did try to make it as if Trump didn't win. And, so it's like for all of the consternation that they may be dumping on Trump.
Yeah, back in 2016?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was the big theme of it. That was what all of Russiagate, the resistance. I mean, think about it for a second.
Even the sanctions.
Imagine
them to put.
But imagine what our pushback would be after January 16th. Or imagine what the Democrats and the media would do if all of a sudden, like the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys and the QAnon or whatever came together and created something they called the resistance.
Right.
as a single front to Biden. Like we would think they're like the Death Eaters.
And then they open up some kind of negotiate, like some kind of I don't know, some investigation. An investigation goes on for years.
Yes.
They don't find anything, and yet they still keep going.
Gosh, and that's the other, okay, so, and then this is another thing that had come to mind and then slipped out when I was saying about it. You have 2016 swinging the pendulum in one direction,
right?
January 6th, and this pushback swinging it in another. But in the meanwhile, you had the Hunter Biden story break, right, which would have significantly affected it, got ignored. You had the Hillary Clinton email story break back in 2016, clearly, right, which also was treated weirdly by the intelligence community and by the media and just in general. You've had like various high-level political scandals that have been suppressed and handled intensely manicured in their own way, and the handling of them has become a part of the discourse too.
Yes,
in other words,
it gets across that you guys are not playing with clean hands.
Exactly.
I mean, you guys are you're dealing with one person in one way and dealing with the other person in this way, especially electronic media.
The perception that we're going through a corrupt process is my point, and that's what justifies the pushback. If you believe that you're going through a corrupt process, then trying to undo it seems pretty natural.
Yes.
And that's the tendency right now, for better and for worse.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's cause for it, sure, but what do you do with it? I don't know. Anyway, we need to go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are headlines. We'll be back in a minute with Laith Maroof. Be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Right now, across Gaza, the West Bank, and other occupied Palestinian territories, we have a massive strike of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that are basically pushing back against Israeli aggression, Israeli occupation, and Israeli theft of land, and not to mention the number of casualties in the context of the conflict, to have a conversation about this upswell of cooperation among Palestinians. We're joined with Laith Marouf. He's a Syrian-born pro-Palestinian activist based in Montreal. He's producer and senior consultant at the Community Media Advocacy Center. Laith, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. When I contacted you yesterday, you mentioned the strike that was taking place, and then all of a sudden, all of the media reports came out with the strike. So great timing on that one, to put it mildly. This is an amazing show of support. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians across the table, including Palestinians that are in the occupied Israeli territories. So, I mean, do you consider this something different this time? I mean, yes, it's a conflict, and yes, they've had these conflicts in the past. But with the amount of what seems to be Palestinian organization or solidarity, is this different this time around?
Yes, it definitely feels different. And before I move forward, I just want to say that I'm half Palestinian, half Syrian, and all Arab, basically. But and I'm currently in Beirut, although I live half my time in Montreal for work. What's happening in Palestine right now is historic, because we're seeing the first time that there is a complete Palestinian revolution on all the historic territory of Palestine. The first such since 1936, and it wasn't called a revolution then, it was called a revolt, and it was a revolt against the British occupation. So we have a full revolution across all of Palestine. As you mentioned, the Palestinian citizens, if we can call them that, second-class citizens in the ghettos of what is the official apartheid Israel, the Palestinians that remained after the genocide, the Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, were out on a national open-ended strike. They were joined by the Syrian population of the occupied parts of the Golan Heights and the Palestinians inside the West Bank, Bantustan, and the Jerusalem ghettos. And this is added to the fact that Gaza, the besieged concentration camp, is fighting back militarily. And yesterday there was around 4 youth that were shot with live ammunition at the 70 somewhat checkpoints in the West Bank, Bantustan, that confrontations happened at. There was over 1,000 arrested, in 700 of them that are citizens of apartheid state inside the Palestinian ghettos like Al-Lid and Al-Fahim. And a huge part of them were from the Jerusalem ghettos. And so looking at it and looking at what's happening at the borders with Jordanians demonstrating on a daily basis and breaching the border with the occupied territories, tens of them poured into the villages, the Palestinian villages in the Jordan Valley, a very isolated zone that apartheid Israel wants to annex. It's a very fertile land, and reaching those and seeing on the border here with Lebanon every day for the last 2 weeks, demonstrations at the border, people breaking all the security cameras of the occupation forces and scaling the wall and being shot. There was 2 martyrs here in Lebanon in the last week. So
when you're saying that this is something new, why do you say this is something new? Is it just because of the solidarity? Like, that's the part that's not necessarily there before? Israeli Palestinians or the Palestinians that are citizens, ideally, in Israel, that they typically are not necessarily part of the typical protests that are taking place, or they're not part of the conflict, whereas this time they seem to be in solidarity or in alignment with either.
Well, look, every time there was a bout of genocide by apartheid Israel in over the decades, Palestinian citizens of apartheid Israel came out and demonstrated. You know, we remember in the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000, many of these Palestinians came out on the streets and they were shot. There was in one massacre by the Israeli border guards, as they call them, in al-Fahim, shot like 13 Palestinian citizens in a bus. He just walked in and because they were going to a demo and shot them all. And so the reaction from varies of the Palestinians depending on how that are inside apartheid Israel, that are citizens of it, of how much they react to what's happening in the rest of the country, depending on how much oppression they have had. You know, they lived under military rule, actually, as citizens of apartheid Israel until 1965. And this is the military regiments of the British occupation still used. And Netanyahu just declared as the prime minister of apartheid Israel in response to all these citizens of the state, the Palestinians rising up in all their ghettos and kicking out the police, which they did. Now it's been almost a week of most of these ghettos liberated from the police, has declared that he will be trying those 700 somewhat citizens that were arrested in the last few days under that same military regulation. So he's suspending the civil rights, the legal rights of the supposed citizens of apartheid Israel, the Palestinians, and to try them in military court.
Please. Okay, so the local victory here for the Palestinian side, for I guess Hamas specifically, would be if they can protect and retake, you know, recently appropriated and the ongoing settlement areas that are currently under discussion about being taken. All this whole process. The bigger victory would be taking back, you know, long since taken territories and pushing for independence, which seems next to impossible.
One of the attack on the Aqsa Mosque said that their goal is to lift the hand of apartheid Israel off Jerusalem, and they will not stop until that happens. You see, like there's the Palestinian resistance is trying to redraw the parameters of engagement, military engagement, and that's the new parameter that they're proposing is that any attack on Jerusalem or any Palestinian on any part of the historic land of Palestine will entail retaliation from every and any part of historic Palestine. And that's where what they're trying to set as the new parameters of engagement. Of course, Netanyahu and apartheid Israel cannot accept this new parameter. And because if they do, it means that they will have to cease looting lands in the West Bank and ethnically cleansing Palestinians from inside Jerusalem. And that means to them a capitulation to the Palestinians. And so we see, on one hand, the arrogance of the supremacist ideal of Zionism, not allowing it to accept a basic small demand of an end to violation of the human rights of Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank. And therefore, the battle is going to continue.
But Leif,
because of this arrogance, yes.
That kind of goes both ways. I don't mean whether Palestinians are morally right to resist, 1,000%. No, like there's no hedge with me on that front at all. But whether they're morally right to resist is something secondary to whether or not they have, let's say, the military might to do so. And so in this situation, if Hamas or if the pushback really is, we're going to keep doing this until hands off Jerusalem, do they have the capability of maintaining that and keeping that up and maintaining that standard?
Yes, they do have the capabilities. You see, we have seen in the past 24 hours only, the Palestinian resistance forces firing submarine drones on the gas installations, looting the gas out of the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Gaza. blown to bits, submarine drones. We've seen them pound all the Israeli bases across Gaza nonstop. And they said they're ready for another 2 months of this. Okay, so the infrastructure of all of apartheid Israel, we're talking about airports, seaports, are all destroyed and closed. The bases all around in the south have been leveled. All the infrastructure of the gas and oil has been leveled. Even was the shocking thing that happened the day before was the major gas installation of apartheid Israel. It's called the Leviathan gas field, which is 130 kilometers off the coast of Haifa, more than 300 kilometers off the coast of Gaza. Blew up at sunset. And, the sun already had set. The dusk was there. There was no more sun. It created a new sun for people looking from the beach of Haifa. So the Palestinians have put forward this, and they are achieving their goals. It's up to now the Zionists to decide, are they going to continue this? And I think this battle, the only way that a ceasefire will happen right now is of a complete unconditional withdrawal of apartheid Israel from the West Bank and Jerusalem. And if that doesn't happen, we are going to a regional war, because the Israelis will the only thing that they can offer to fight back the Palestinians is mass genocide through carpet bombing of Gaza, and still the resistance will fight them back.
Well, what kind of regional war are you talking about? Which outside players would be coming in?
So in the last 4 or 5 days, there's been twice missiles fired from Syria on the Golan Heights occupied zones. There's been twice missiles fired from South Lebanon into North Palestine. And there was a drone 24 hours ago again. This is very important. A drone crossed from Jordan. They don't know if it was who sent it, over Bisan, the area of North Palestine, where it was, shot down by Israelis. So what we have is the Iraqi, the Lebanese, the Syrian, the Yemeni, and the Iranian whole axis of resistance saying they're ready to come to the defense of the Palestinians, but they're not going to intervene right now. What they will wait for, because the Palestinian resistance is actually achieving its goals militarily, and they are winning. Just now, Netanyahu, half an hour or 45 minutes ago, had a press conference and invited 70 ambassadors from mainly the NATO, imperial coalition, and said right in front of them, if Hamas, and he likes to call it Hamas, wins this war, that means a defeat to all of you. And the Palestinians say to him, of course we know that, and we will continue until we expel American occupation from all our region. And that's what's at stake. And so Netanyahu will be committing a massacre in Gaza because he knew and he knows right now that he lost the war. Well, and that will cause a regional conflagration.
I mean, but that is... I understand your point. And I even understand the point of the differences in death toll and how the differences of death toll is an issue of a deterrent, et cetera. But this is very expensive in regards to the number of lives and the Palestinians' lives that are going to be lost in this, not to mention from the standpoint of the territory and everything else. How do you respond to people who make the point of saying, look, it's 30% of the people that are killed are kids? Is there any other pathway forward? Or is this the only pathway forward? And is this kind of issue of attrition where more and more land gets stolen and appropriated without really any consequence associated with it? Do you consider this to be the only path of action? And how do you respond to people who say, well, look, 30% of the people that were killed in this are kids. Is this indeed an appropriate action militarily?
Yes. So here's the thing. There's the only thing that stops an occupier a colonizer specifically, not an occupier, a colonizer, is violence. A colonization of a people in our land is like raping somebody who's confined in a room. The only way they can get the rapist off is either they kill their rapist or somebody comes and saves them from the outside. This is what is the basic of what's happening in Palestine. And for the last 100 somewhat years, the Palestinian people have been slaughtered, sometimes in mass and sometimes slowly. Sometimes in mass, sometimes slowly. And we see right now, actually, obviously it is the Israelis that are the child killers. They targeted yesterday an orphanage. The international agencies that have orphanages, including organizations that are dealing with the psychological PTSD that children have to deal with because of the Israeli continuous war, have 11 of their children martyred, these organizations. So what do we have? The Israelis are going to kill our children no matter what. Either they're going to poison them and with the water supply of Gaza not being drinkable, not allow them to grow and die slowly and everybody's quiet, or we get done with it all at once and they will have to pay for those martyrs, those children. It is not our fault that we're resisting, and it's the only way we can actually save our children.
Apartheid. I wanted to talk about Hamas generally for a second. As this process goes on, you were talking earlier about how one victory condition here would be if the Palestinian forces, specifically if Hamas, could create a unified response across all of the territories to respond in the future, in a more unified way together to respond to anything. Because, like you're saying, this is the first time you've seen like a sort of large-scale uprising across Palestinian territories, as well as inside Israel, with a lot of civil conflict between Arab Israelis and either Jewish Israelis or other Israeli groups. So that's all been happening. But I guess where I would go with this is that unified response would be under Hamas. And earlier you were talking about using even your metaphor about the room and the rape. You have two responses there. One is to either violently push back against the person who's doing that to you, the party that's doing that to you, or to call for an outside response. It seems like between Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, Abbas and the PLO are the group that are pushing for an outside response more, and Hamas is the group that is much more on the side of violently trying to overthrow the oppressive force. And it seems like with this conflict, Hamas is definitely winning. They've gotten what they wanted. They've taken the lead, which, of course, I mean, they already had that. But I'll put it like this. 4 days ago, there was an article that came out saying that no Arab leaders have contacted Mahmoud Abbas since the beginning of the conflict. Now, we're 10 days into it. That was 6 days into it at that point. I don't know what it's been since then, if he's been contacted. But he has been sidelined through this process. So I could see this and paint this slightly as a Hamas power grab, but would you think that's fair? And could you just briefly explain, what's important to understand about Hamas, the PLO, what they're each pushing for, where they're coming from? Laith.
So look, the PLO is a big organization. Fatah is the group that Abbas is in charge of as a political party. They have become collaborators. That's what happened. The PA, the Palestinian Authority, has its security forces in the West Bank that are trained by General Dalton of the United States and are directly under the command of CIA and Mossad agents. So the only reason that we don't see much of an armed uprising in the West Bank right now is because actually on a nightly basis, the Palestinian Authority goons are arresting people from their houses. So in the last few days, actually, and this is very important to note about the sidelining of Mahmoud Abbas and the PA and also his party, Fatah. The youth wing of the Fatah party issued a statement, and this is like 3-4 days ago when the beginning of the huge demonstrations started in the West Bank, shaming the old guard of the party and saying that their statements and conduct has been unbecoming of the Palestinian people and their struggle. And last night, what used to be one of the main armed militias of Fatah, they're called the Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, that are controlled or loyal to Barghouti, the Mandela of the Palestinians that is in the Israeli jails, came out in the streets of Ramallah, the fiefdom of Abbas, fully armed in the streets, parading. And they were supposed to have been suspended, and they actually issued a statement saying that they have been in secret hiding in fear of Abbas and his PA goons, but now they're out militarily, and they will be targeting the forces of occupation in the West Bank. And yesterday there was multiple, incidents of exchanges of live ammunition between Israeli troops and these forces. So we have clearly Abbas has been sidelined, not because people are trying to sideline him. In fact, the Hamas keeps on trying to say, no, we have to have unity, come. But because he's insignificant, can't even control his own fiefdom, let alone his youth or his armed militia, they're all out of his control. And he doesn't represent the Palestinian people, or even the ones inside Israel. They're mobilizing by themselves, and the people in Gaza are under others. So who does he represent? Nobody knows.
Well, that even gets to the whole thing about elections in the West Bank that he seems to be putting off, knowing that he will get that much more undermined if those elections went forward. There's right much politics taking place there. I also kind of want to get into this thing about the other countries that have signed on to the United States, overt relationship with Israel, where the upper echelon of those countries have basically joined hands in coordination. What are the governments, or what are the countries, the people of those countries, what are they saying now? How are the leadership of those countries dealing with it? But we have a caller before we get to that. Michael from Sydney. Michael, what's going on, man?
Yeah. I'd like to have just have a quick chat to Leith and just put some of the things I've been hearing from him put forward. I think there's actually been not only a big swing in Palestine and surrounding countries against the occupation, but there's also been a shift in the media here in Australia at least. We're seeing a lot more coverage, a lot less biased coverage. Although, I heard say on the ABC, which is our broadcaster here, that seven hospitals were damaged in the West Bank, during the fighting. I mean, if it was in Syria, they'd be saying they were bombed and destroyed, and the last hospital was on its last legs, and, Assad's going to wipe out the last hospital, but apparently they were just damaged in the fighting somehow. No one mentions they were bombed by Israel. There's a mass hypocrisy in the media still, but I feel like there's a massive ground shift, especially amongst the youth. I'm quite active on Douyin. I watch a lot of people live, and or the TikTokers, as it's known over here in the West. And there's a lot of people talking about Palestine and becoming very emotional about it. And really, it's starting to become a very prominent issue amongst the youth, especially amongst university students and younger people. And it's like they're having an awakening about what's been going on in Israel. I mean, some of it's sort of jumping on the bandwagon. But I feel there's a genuine sort of change in the younger generations and more of an awareness about what's going on in the Middle East. That's sort of an external opinion, and I just fully support what's going on basically on behalf of the Palestinians, what they're doing by fighting back. And, I mean, this has been an issue going on since 1948, and basically it's been totally ignored in the Western media and amongst Western youth even.
Mike from Sydney.
So I'd just like to...
Thank you, Mike. Not just ignored, covered, whitewashed. And look, Mike is making a really good point, Leah. I mean, in the United States, one of the most iconic scenes, even though it may not be considered a huge amount, I think in the future it will be considered to be significant. Rashid Tlaib putting her hand on Joe Biden, arguing for the Palestinian cause. I mean, an American president basically with this kind of impassioned plea of saying you can't allow them to continuously kill, not just kill with American weapons and American whitewashing and American protection. And having her on the airport, holding on to Joe Biden, trying to make that case. That is look, it may not seem like much, but you have maybe 25 lawmakers here that are pushing Biden to do something, and that is not something that you typically see here. I mean, I can go back several years ago, and the language about apartheid and stuff like that, that language had become far more normal in regards to its usage. I wasn't sure about that, but the more we have this conversation, the more I think that the land is shifting on this. Leah, before we close, we're about to leave. Do you have anything to say about what Mike said? And more importantly, well, not more importantly, to add to that, just before we close, I want to get into the other governments. Yes. But go ahead, please.
Yes. Look, it's clear that the Palestinian people all around the world have put all their effort to send the message to humanity about what is happening there. And this is no thanks to the Western media, who have actually been censoring all content that is being produced about Palestine. For instance, in Canada, the CBC had right now centralized all content to be produced about Palestine in the hand of two individuals that have the last call to what is allowed to be aired, which happen to be both of them Zionist, Jewish, white people. And so there's a revolt of anchors and journalists at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation because their content was not being aired. In fact, they refused to air not one story during the 12 days of uprising in the Aqsa Mosque when the Israeli troops wanted to occupy Al-Aqsa. Before one even rocket fell from Gaza, the CBC refused to air one story about that and only began covering it when Hamas responded to the massacre in Al-Aqsa. So we have right now, they're so scared, not only the Zionists, but all the imperialists, that they are curtailing, and this is there's 300 journalists that signed a petition in Canada because this is happening in every newsroom, print, radio, television. They are trying to stop the journalists from covering this story. And added to it that the social media like Facebook and Instagram that it owns, they set their standards. Council headed by an Israeli Mossad agent, ex-member of the Unit 82, responsible for all the espionage and electronic warfare, and has been banning thousands, tens of thousands of pages and people in the last 3 weeks, including my account has been banned for life. I've been deleted, and they're refusing to give me my 14-year archive on Facebook. So, to the point where they had to ban the hashtags for the word Palestine and the word Jerusalem in every language. This is how crazy they were. And thanks to the Palestinian people in the diaspora, in our homeland, and thanks to all the amazing humans on this planet who kept on insisting to retweet and speak about Palestine and refusing for it to be hidden behind the firewalls of propaganda of the empire, we and our story has made it. The floods have broken. They cannot hold it back. And our resistance on the ground is what will bring us victory because we are still standing on our feet.
One last question before we close, and this has to do with the other governments. The governments that have basically signed on to Israel under the Trump administration, I believe it was Sudan, it was UAE, Bahrain, these governments that have basically said, look, we're going to open up, what's the word I'm looking for? Organization with Israel. We're going to open up peaceful ties with Israel. What have been the response to the populations of those countries?
It's hilarious. It's hilarious. Look, in Bahrain every day, which is one of a vessel of Saudis and then the United States, every day demonstrations out in the street. This is one of the countries that normalized. In the Emirates, hundreds of people making videos. In Saudi-occupied Arabia itself, the eastern provinces, which are, quote unquote Shia, who are directly occupied by the Saudi military, are out every day. People in Sudan yesterday were out in the hundreds. In Morocco, another, normalizing state, hundreds of people being beaten up and they're still coming out. So what we have is actually what these Gulf vessels and apartheid Israel and Trump and all the American empire spent in the last 10 years of trillions of dollars to destroy all the Arab republics, to make sure that there's nobody to defend Palestine when it's left alone. And all the trillions of dollars they spent on this normalization and the deal of the century and the Abraham Accords, with one Palestinian standing on his feet defending the Aqsa Mosque, poof, all that money and is the worth of fake normalization with imperialism and genocide and colonialism disappeared. The Arab people are out in the streets. I tell you, when apartheid Israel falls, I am sure of this, and it will fall, there will be millions of people breaching the borders from Lebanon, from Syria, from Jordan, just like they did when apartheid Israel withdrew from South Lebanon. And we will see the joyous scenes of Arab people across all of greater Syria walking back and deleting, erasing the fake Psyche-Pico colonial borders. This is how serious the situation in Palestine is.
Laith, the voice that you guys are listening to is Laith Maruth. He's a Syrian-born pro-Palestinian activist in Montreal. He's producer, senior consultant at the Community Media Advocacy Center. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we are back, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We've got like 6 minutes here. I want to go straight to Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Good morning, gentlemen. Free Julian Assange. WikiLeaks was sending out documents on what was happening, in the Gaza Strip and West Bank, dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It was showing people good information about what was going on, the atrocities committed that was against the Palestinians, and we need to push for the BDS. And also, soccer players in Europe, 4 of them, that 4 players was holding the Palestinian flag. That's a good thing, because once you see athletes get involved, everybody watch athletes, but, and people got their favorite movie stars and things, but athletes, they're on a different level. So, we got to push for peace in the Middle East. I want Israel and Palestinians to have peace. I'm for a two-state solution, and I want peace over there. So, yeah, that's all I want to say. Free Julian Assange, and I thank all the soccer players came out and supporting the Palestinians, some of the soccer players.
Tarif, thanks for the call. Jamarl, had you seen that?
I have not seen that.
Neither have I.
Yeah, but I'm not a big soccer person, to be fair. No. If that makes sense.
If I'm being honest with you, neither am I. But I had fun growing up. Anywho,
my wife, they used to play. I mean, my wife's what is it? My wife's their brothers. They used to play growing up. they were big into it.
Yeah.
As they got it, but it's the States, right? So it's not something that we do heavily in the United States.
Taking your calls, 202-521-1320. For some reason, I'm still caught up in the mindset or the mood that Laith Maroof set when he was going out. He sounded rapturous.
Yes.
He sounded...
I noticed that too.
You know what I'm talking about?
Very strong in this notion of one day we will take back, it's like, it's the Martin Luther King thing. Like, and I don't mean Martin Luther King. I don't mean that. It's just this thing of like, when we get to the promised land, we will be on this. It's that feel or that sound to it. Look, I don't have context. And because I don't have context, it's hard to kind of really get it in a gut level.
Well, it feels like religious conviction. When you bring up Martin Luther King Jr., obviously preacher.
Yeah. But that's what it feels like.
That's what it feels like. But of course, Hamas is also an Islamic organization. It's a religious organization.
Yeah. But see, I don't think he's talking about it. I think he's talking about it more in terms of...
No, but the conviction comes with it. That's my point.
Conviction, yes, but not conviction in the sense that Jesus is coming back. Not in that sense, but conviction in the sense of we're going to be liberated.
One day soon, it's all going to change. Right. We're going to be rising up, and as long as one person is standing, and it invalidates the goals of our enemies.
Exactly. Right. And it's intense.
It will fall. It's all going to yeah, it is intense. Yeah. But I don't know. There's something about that mood that just really stuck out to me. I don't think it's just him as a person.
No, that's not.
And
him
I'm not trying to be weird. I would say the exact same thing to him if you were here.
Yeah,
you sound rapturous, and not just passionate, but like there's a deeper level for you.
It's very intense. It's not okay. One day this is going to be fixed.
Yeah,
it's one day Israel is going to fall. They're going to, the Zionist cause is going to be destroyed, and we're going to be standing, and the people are going to come in from the other areas. It's pretty intense. I mean, I get where he's coming from. It is rapturous. It is borne out about injustice.
And even the tenor of the language, I'm not seriously criticizing it. I'm just commentating or whatever.
Yeah.
Because I'm not trying to quote unquote tone police him. But the tenor of the language, when, each term fitting in its own way, but when he's using apartheid Israel, instead of referring to Israel as apartheid Israel, colonizers, the oppressors,
very specific.
The language that he's using is consistent.
Yeah.
It's not. I wouldn't say. I don't know if it's hyperbolic is the thing. I don't even know if that word's appropriate. He wouldn't
consider it hyperbolic. He'd consider it like if somebody says Israel is an apartheid state. Is that hyperbolic? If you were Israeli, maybe. But if you weren't,
no. But if you say it every time, it's not so much the hyperbole as the consistently different framing from the terms that most people use for it, where it is decidedly and consistently different.
Yeah.
From how people think of it in a way where you have, I don't know.
Well, the way people talk about it. I think what you're pointing to is under normal circumstances, people don't consistently say apartheid state Israel or occupying state Israel. They would just say Israel.
Exactly.
And he's very consistent in making
always
sure that the word
at every turn remind you what he sees the reality as being there.
Yes.
And I hear it.
He's very clear. He's very consistent.
We've got a caller.
Yeah.
We've got Tim calling in from South Carolina. Tim, you're on. What's on your mind?
All right, real quick, I just don't understand how anyone can see how much land that Israel is taking and not see a problem with that. But that's all. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you. You too, Tim. We're planning on talking to one next hour.
Yeah,
I believe. I don't want to. I could be wrong about some aspect of that, but I think he'll be on that side of it. Anyway, we're going to be talking with Carmine Sabia. Who takes a decidedly pro-Israeli side. So it should be an interesting and fun conversation. Anyway, we got to close this hour out. You can hear the exit music. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and our last hour of today's show. Fault Lines, Thomas, Stranahan. See you on the other side of the short hour break.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show in the United States, covering news, politics, events, and more from across our disunited country and the surface of our increasingly embattled, divided, fragmented, implosive globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm going to be honest, I just made the mistake of almost calling myself Jamarl Thomas.
Did you?
Which I would really be turning the tables on you, Jamarl, by flipping it around like that. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, there were more than 27,910 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday, with just under 867 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of 31,149 cases per day. That's down 35% from the average 2 weeks ago. 37% of the American public has been fully vaccinated at this point. 48% of people have received at least one dose, at least partially vaccinated. As of this morning, to give you the total numbers, the coronavirus has infected more than 33,024,000 people across the United States and killed about 586,824 people. The European Union has approved a plan to reopen borders to vaccinated Americans and other international travelers following more than a year of border restrictions, although word has not come out when the change will go into effect and a final formal approval is still needed. The passage of the plan is secure. Those traveling into the EU would need to have taken vaccines which have already been given the green light in the bloc. Those already approved by the European Medicines Authority. The Serum Institute of India, that's the world's largest maker of vaccines, has said it does not expect to resume exports of its vaccines until the end of the year. The institute said its priority would be to help India, which is still in the middle of its second and by far steepest wave of coronavirus infections. In France, terraced eating and drinking at bars and restaurants is reopening, along with cinemas and movie theaters, museums, and non-essential shops easing back into action as the country lightens its COVID policies. The finance minister called the opening up a symbolic step in the country's economic recovery. In national political news back here in the States, the Attorney General of New York has told the Trump Organization that an investigation into his business dealings has moved from a civil to a criminal investigation. They're looking into whether his company defrauded customers by inflating the values of assets. Trump has denied wrongdoing. I shouldn't say his wrongdoing necessarily, because that's assuming that he was doing wrong. And anyway, it's a safe assumption though. A House vote is expected today on the creation of a commission to look into the events of January 6th and the response to it. Republicans are divided on the vote there. In international political news, 293 people have now been killed in total in the ongoing violent conflict between Israel and Gaza as that conflict enters its 10th day. Israel said it tried to kill the military chief of Hamas several times yesterday, and rumors of an incipient truce are now being denied by both Hamas and the Israeli government as some neighboring countries continue to push for a quick and peaceful resolution to the crisis. Lebanon's foreign minister has asked to be fired following comments he made earlier this week when he said that Gulf countries had encouraged the rise of the Islamic State. He angered Gulf countries, accusing them of that effectively. Over in Japan, the International Olympic Committee and Japanese officials have insisted that the Summer Olympic Games will go ahead despite the ongoing pandemic. And in Earth and Science news, more than 70 people are still missing after a cyclone battered the west coast of India this week, tearing through an offshore oil rig off the coast of Mumbai and downing an accommodation barge with 260 people on board. And with that, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to quickly step back through a couple of these headlines. For one thing, tearing through an offshore oil rig off the coast of Mumbai. Offshore oil rig is fun to say. It's a fun thing to say. Offshore oil rig off the coast of Mumbai. It feels like a song lyric or something like that from some sort of esoteric artist or something. I don't know. But it's fun to say. And I'm glad that the Olympics are going to be coming back later this year. I'm glad that we're going to be able to watch the Olympics. I like watching the Olympics. Again, like I think the last time we talked about it, it's like watching a fire or something like that.
Yeah.
It just hangs out, on the TV and you watch different games.
Well, I like the idea that the world is coming together to do something other than kill each other.
Oh, that's always exciting, isn't it?
That's always exciting. I like the competition of it. I like honestly, it's not even what they're doing. It's just the competition of it.
You like the competition of it. That
it's
is
like
you're
America versus this country, and all of these guys are in a cage match with one another.
For those left in the dark, Jamarl, long-term chess player, always into the competition.
Well, I just like the competition of it. Like this country versus the other country. Like for example, if you were in if your country, let's say we did hockey or soccer here. And, America or Richmond versus, I don't know, something in soccer or New York versus whatever. I mean, we'd see it in our football, like, New York and the New York Giants and the people from New York are wearing this gear. They're fighting the people from, I like it. I think there's something about it that, I don't know. It's under this notion of conflict, but it's conflict in a way that is cooperative in a weird way. It's hard to explain. Like it's conflict, but not necessarily deleterious conflict.
Yeah, that's a good kind of thing. Conflict. I mean, competition in general. Conflict is one thing.
Yeah,
competition, of course, is one side of conflict. You can't really have one without the other, I don't think. But competition in general has this interesting quality in that people who compete with each other tend to become more similar in different ways because and so you end up fighting the thing that you're closest to. If you competed on certain grounds for your entire life, you might have the most in common with the person. If you're at the head of the pack,
right.
If you're the best at something, you're probably going to have a lot in common in terms of how you think, what you do, your approach to life as your main rival there.
Yeah, because oftentimes it's not like these large, Spider-Man is not fighting Galactus.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. It's like you're fighting the people who are in your same sandbox. And the tactics and the techniques and stuff like that got one person to a certain place, those people tend to make small changes around that stuff, not these kind of wide swaths.
Well, and if you look at, who are you most likely to be in competition with in your everyday life, it's going to be your peers.
Right.
And there's actually this philosopher, Rene Girard, who kind of looks at this and in a weird way sort of turns the table and says, that is true. There's all this, and this has been described before, but at the same time, yes, it's psychology, actually. What determines what you want? What do I want? What do you want? What determines desire? What he says is we imitate other people's desires. We learn to want what other people want. And this makes sense kind of intuitively. As you're growing up, you see what your parents, you see what different people in society.
Because how would you know otherwise?
Yeah, you might have a role model who wants something, and you're like, okay, I'm going to want that thing too. And you don't think those thoughts necessarily, but you want what they want. But what this leads to is people wanting the same things, necessarily competing over them.
Yes.
Entering into competition and growing ever more similar.
Yeah.
And that's the root of all tragedy. If you look at, the literally tragedy, it's not just a sort of dramatic narrative that involves sadness. It's people who are the most similar and ending up destroying each other because they want the same things in all these different narratives. Anyway, one way in which competition can be productive, I want to talk about India for a second. The Serum Institute of India.
I saw that.
Yeah, world's largest maker of vaccines, saying they won't be able to get any vaccines out for export until after this year is over. That's a big, big, big deal.
That's a big deal, but why did they, they were basically transporting vaccines outside of India while India was in the middle of the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're like, okay, we're going to stop doing that. Why did it take you?
Well, because they're the tail, they're not the dog. The Modi's government didn't, Modi's government wanted more exports, wanted the industry.
I know. No. I totally feel you on that point. I'm just making the point that the fact that they were putting these things out, like, because people may not realize this, India is one of the major drug suppliers to the world.
Big pharmaceutical industry.
To the maker. Yeah. And so it's like this country that has been slammed and racked with an inability to get their hands on vaccines are also the major supplier of those vaccines.
Yeah.
Weird is that? Like we have some just weird things in our system, in our world. Like you would have all these people who are outside of a factory. Those people are dead broke. All the equipment works. Everything works. Everything else in there is exactly the same. All things are basically the same, and those guys are out there not being able to do the job. Like, or for that matter, the food production stuff or the vaccine production stuff.
Well, and here's one of the interesting things. So you have. What is this? Okay, what's this problem caused by? You can apply it to a couple of other things. You can look at Trump's trade war with China. You could look at the slowdown in trade in general following the lockdowns, during the pandemic. All this stuff. What's stopping any individual country from having economic and industrial autarky, where they provide for all of their own needs? Well, not just the economic reality of the division of labor and the idea that some places you're going to have hubs where certain things are produced more cheaply or whatever, and therefore you get this sort of diversified economy, even across the globe, as of course it has become over the past couple of centuries. Anyway, you get that. That makes sense. And then there's also this ideological component to it in which, okay, so we split up our trade, different regions of the world produce different things so that we don't fight each other, basically, so that we're mutually dependent on each other. I need you to produce semiconductors and you need me to produce lamps, whatever. And we trade and things get along.
If we fight one another, I'm not going to have my lamps. You're not going to have your semiconductors.
But of course, and the problem with that as an economic ideology is that economics is inevitably tied to politics, and it is politically expedient at certain times to introduce sanctions or tariffs to support key industries, or when you enter a crisis and you absolutely need domestic production of something because global trade is shut down, you suddenly don't have it.
Right.
And it's just weird. I don't know. It's just interesting to me. It seems this is one of those cases where these conversations, economics and politics, are happening on the high level in the ivory tower. Those are ultimately the people who are deciding what's going to happen, pretty much by definition. And they're talking in terms of economics, but it is an absolutely BS economic ideology that comes from their politics, that everybody hesitates to directly say comes directly from their politics, and that they put forward with this veil that it has deep economic foundational beliefs down to its roots. But no, it's just a political expression in your interest at this point in time.
They act like it's natural. Like it's God-given. Like this is just the way the cosmos is. And honestly, if you didn't know any better and you were raised, you would think the same way. Like it's only,
and they're priests.
You hit your head on it.
They're priests. They're interpreting things that the average person doesn't understand, casting themselves as experts, while effectively what they do is decide by fiat what would be best for their interests to be considered the case.
Well, unfortunately, when people are, let's say, given that ideology, I mean, this goes back to the thing of why do you want something? Well, this person wants it because that person wants it. If Superman was born in, Russia, what would Superman be like as opposed to born in America? That type of stuff. I mean, but they don't know that. Like, they don't know that. I think that's, this gets to the whole schooling argument. This gets to the whole argument of, like, how people are educated and everything else. But if you are a child and you're born into a particular country or a particular world, you don't know any of that stuff. All of that stuff is just dropped into you. And somewhere along the way, you're like, wait a minute, I don't know if that's right. But you might be like 40 years old, hitting your head on that stuff as opposed to, 20 or 15 or 12.
Yeah.
Man, the education system and all of that stuff is very, very vitally important. But all of those things usually serve the interests of either state or either the economic system in the way that it works.
And the economic system is always supportive of the state.
Yes.
Because any economic system, quote unquote, it's not like a divine force, an invisible entity with an invisible hand that steers the direction of things. An economy is the product of A, certain technologies, and B, certain players coming together and deciding
ideological choices that they're making.
Yeah, setting up rules, and these things are just built over generations. Obviously, all this stuff is pretty old.
It's not God-given. That's my point.
No, but I guess what's discussed, what's a technocracy. The idea about a technocracy. What would worry me, and what I think would happen, would be, it's not that you get this all-powerful ruling class that is so masterly that they can command anything from the public. It's that they're incompetent. For me, both of them are in their own ways are completely valid concerns.
They're incompetent.
But I think what would be most likely is that You have a technocracy that has lost the game, that has no understanding of what rules they're supposed to be playing by, has no understanding of what techniques are available to them, really. It are lying to themselves, are deluding themselves into thinking they're experts on things that, on which they aren't, that lack the relevant experience, that have lost their stuff over generations, and that are somehow, because the boat itself has strong enough nails and strong enough boards, they think that they're steering it. But no, it's just careening. It's careening. They don't know what they're doing, and it's managing to keep itself going, even though they're asleep at the wheel, effectively.
On some level, I think there's truth to that. I think, I know you say they're incompetent. I think initially, I think they're greedy, and maybe the greed is the thing that's bleeding into this notion of competence. Where you made a good point that if the country itself is falling apart, then how are you going to be able to maintain your wealth, your status, if you're not necessarily within a country that allows you to maintain that wealth and status? Meaning, if you are taking a certain tact, certain actions that are basically undermining the boat, then how are you going to ever be able to maintain your own standing? So that's a fair point. I think the issue is greed, where it's this belief that because things have been, that they will always be.
Maybe. Well, but that you can, I guess that's one of my issues. I think that's a fundamental human issue, frankly, because if you think about it, what drives the decisions that you make? You have this sort of short-term bias. You have this way of doing things that you've always done things, and you're oriented and anchored to that, oriented based on that. That limits what you can do. All this stuff, that you that on a deeply human level. But the same thing is going to steer the decisions of the most powerful people in the world. There are going to be some differences, but probably what seems to be a fundamental tenet of human behavior, that we're used to what we're used to, and we want to keep it in place for as long as it'll keep us alive. We stick with that.
Pretty much.
Pretty much. And so that's what they're pushing for too, I think. Anyway, we need to go to a break and come back with Carmine Sabia talking Israel and more. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So we've been having a conversation about Israel going forward. And in the context of this conversation, just to give people an update, there have been 293 people that have been killed in ongoing violence between Israel and Gaza as this enters its 10th day. And we've had apparently other countries that have been pushing for peaceful resolution. The United States is this is the 3rd time that the U.S. has avoided the resolution or prevented the resolution from going through. We're going to have a conversation about this conflict. We're joined with Carmine Sabia. He's a Christian conservative pundit, writer, and editor. Carmine, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, gentlemen.
Absolutely. So, Carmine, I'll just softball it and give a very basic, straightforward question. With the conflict that has been taking place over the last 10 days, how have you been viewing this? How do you frame what has been taking place for the last couple of weeks?
Israel under attack again, and getting crapped on by the Squad and others for defending itself. Israel is often asked to take things that we would never take. If there was rockets being lobbed in from Canada or Mexico, nobody would expect us to not respond with force.
Well, I mean, if rockets were being lobbed in from Mexico or Canada, and that's true, then we wouldn't necessarily tolerate that. By the same token, Mexico and Canada shouldn't tolerate us, pilfering property from Mexico and Canada. It's not so much that the rockets are great. It's also that the theft is not great. How do you deal with people making this kind of point of saying, look, they're trying to expropriate more land, and the rockets on some level are either one or two things, either a pushback from the expropriation of land, or it's Netanyahu basically trying to stay in power, or some combination of both. How do you deal with people making, the different reasons for why this is taking place?
So you have to understand where my position is. Israel is Israel. It's one state. Palestinians live there. But there is no Palestine. There never was a Palestine.
The Bible would greatly disagree with you.
Yeah, I understand that. It wasn't called Palestine. But the Palestinians that are there now were just displaced Jordanians. And the Bible would also tell you that is Israel's land given to them by God himself. And so as far as I'm concerned, and this is, of course, Israel's manifest destiny as well, that is their land. People want this one sliver of land to be a two-state solution. Israel is surrounded on all sides, by people who hate them. This is you got Hamas, Iranian-backed militants in Hamas. This is not about rights and property, and this is about Hamas and the Palestinians in general don't believe Israel even has a right to exist. So how I would defend it is I would say that Israel is just reclaiming their own land. I'm not a huge fan, I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of displacing people from their homes regardless. I think that makes...
So you do accept...
Because that's the fundamental contradiction. That would be the fundamental problem with it. In the same way that that Zionists who are looking at this, revert to biblical claims as the sort of reason for choosing that region of the world and as a justification for it. If the Palestinians have to refer back that long, it's as old. But the Palestinians culturally seems to, geographically, they were living there at the time. They were the people who were living in the region when Israel, the state of Israel, of course, was created. So I don't know how you get around that. And that would be the rub, that you're kicking people out of a zone as you come in. And you said, well, the countries surrounding them hate them. I don't think that they would nearly as much if there had been a peaceful resolution of this process a lot earlier, or if there was some process of mutual, and I don't know how this would work, but it doesn't seem impossible to me, mutual joint development, immigration, and an influx of capital into the region instead of ongoing military occupation of this territory. There are ways in which this could have gone better, and I think they would be better for the security, the stability of the state of Israel in whatever form it takes, in that version of 2021. But I can also see it working. Carmine, the contradiction there? How do you deal with that?
Well, let me ask you a question. How many times in my lifetime was a two-state solution offered to Arafat, and it was flat out refused?
Well, I couldn't answer that because I don't know exactly how old you are, and I would not know the exact number in any event. But
it's a lot.
I'm sure plenty. But if the deal is unsatisfactory, I mean, it seems like Palestine has been left ever more fragmented. And
Palestine's not a place. But here's the thing:
Palestine is literally a place.
Is Israel a place? I don't know. I mean. The Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian territories are suggestive of a Palestine.
I mean, does Palestine have a seat at the United Nations?
No, of course
Is that
not.
your standard?
But Israel didn't until, within this last century. I mean, these things are kind of all incipient. In the grand scheme of history, decades doesn't compare to millennia, This is so recent.
I understand what you're saying, but they're not a country. That's so.
Well, they're not a country because they're being occupied and prevented from being a country. I mean,
If you're not a country, how can you be occupied?
Well, the question becomes, what is a country? I mean, this gets into this kind of nomenclature stuff. I think what it boils down to is for Israel to be created, it had to be created somewhere out of something. That's the rub. And that's the rub that is difficult to get around.
It wasn't created some random place. It was created the place that it was for millennia.
Well, what do you mean where it was for millennia? Because it was, up until pretty recently, occupied by the Ottomans, as far as I know, for quite a while. Like, there have been various parties in control of that zone over the course of fairly recent history.
You have to understand from my perspective.
Well, but where does that? Okay, I guess more specifically, where does that perspective come from, and can you back that up a bit?
It's my religious perspective. God literally gave them that land.
Yeah, but see, I mean,
there is no higher authority.
But even that's a modern interpretation of Judaism. The idea of Zionism, this late 19th century belief, that's a pretty recent construction, reinterpreting thousands-of-year-old religious history.
No, I mean, read the book. Read the book.
But then why was there no formal official push for an Israeli Jerusalem and an Israeli Levant or Israel as a state?
They were kicked out of their own land, and they didn't have the power to bring themselves back. And
is that the story? Because it seems like Zionism is not just a unique political force, but a unique set of ideas that serve as, again, a reinterpretation of what it means to be a Jew. We have this guest, Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, who we've had on the show to discuss this topic. Again, he's a rabbi, Orthodox Jew, but is critical of the state of Israel because he sees it as sort of supplanting Judaism and trying to claim something that Judaism never claimed. And he also, furthermore, one of his big criticisms is the way that being a Jew has become increasingly an ethnic grouping as opposed to a religious one. He thinks denudes Judaism as a religion because it means that suddenly Judaism is not tied to religious conviction in any way. You can have a million atheistic Jews, and
correct.
That's one of his criticisms. But again, just open conversation. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm not a Jew, so I can't opine on that. I would say to you that my friend Dov Hinkind, who was a New York assemblyman, a Democrat, would vehemently disagree with him, and he's a guy you should have on. Actually,
well, what was his name?
You set that up.
What was his name?
Dov Hinkind.
Hinkind.
Hikind. And he would be. I'll set the interview up for you. He'd be a great interview.
That would be awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the offer.
Yeah, he could speak to this even more than I could, way more than I could. But to me, it's the state of Israel, and they are surrounded by terrorism. And it seems to me that Israel's the only one that's ever asked to show restraint. If Israel was the evil state that people say it is on the left, right? You tell me how long, if Israel really wanted to end this thing with the weaponry it has, how long it would take.
What do you mean? If they just openly slaughtered as many people as possible?
If they just said, we're going to finish this. This is our land, and we're going to finish this.
Well, if they did the genocide option, they could probably get it done within months. I don't think it would be faster than that, but they could probably get it done within months, probably less than years, just because there's so many armaments available. But it's like, that's the last thing I want to consider. What's up?
No. What I'm saying is, if they were the evil place that a lot of people want to paint them as.
Yeah, but why is that the
standard? They can end this in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, but again, like Jamarl saying,
why is that the standard? That's such a warped standard.
Yeah.
And honestly,
that's like the equivalent of the Nazis.
I don't know how to do anything with the religious argument. Meaning, like, I could say, well, it's my religious conviction that's Palestinian land. I mean, it says Palestine in the Bible. Those Palestinian territory. I mean, you're basically stealing. Meaning, your religious tradition, I can't do anything with that. You have some people who believe Jesus is coming back. You have other people who believe that, this XYZ needs to take place for the world to come to an end. I mean, like, this is a political conversation, not a religious one. And so I understand
but you can't,
your religious
you
convictions.
Can't get around it for some of us because our political position on this is rooted in our religious position on this.
again, you said it yourself. You're not a. We keep cutting in. We're trying to go for a faster pace thing, so I'm not trying to cut you off at every turn. But
I'm not a Jew, correct?
You're not a Jew, exactly. You're a Christian. I'm going to be blunt and perhaps slightly derogatory here, but isn't that like the equivalent of the white guilt thing, but for Christians? Like trying to make up for something having to do with Judaism. So you're like, we're with you guys. You got this.
Not at all.
We're going to back you up.
Our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, was a Jew. His Father, God Almighty, called the Jews his chosen people. We are defending God's chosen people.
I know, Carmine. I'm just saying, but that's so, like, there's nowhere to go with that. Like, anybody can say that. Anybody, like, I can say right here that it is my religious belief that that land is not Israelis. And because that's my religious belief, right, but that's kind of my point. This is a political conversation. This is a conversation about land. This is not a conversation about religion.
But if me and you had a conversation about abortion, where do my beliefs on that come from?
Yeah, I would be just for your beliefs. Who am I to say that they shouldn't? I guess
they're married. I can't separate it. It's a married belief.
Yeah,
I know, but that married belief is now creating a pretext where people are being killed and displaced from their land.
And
one group is basically saying that land is mine because God gave it to me.
People are being killed because Hamas hates Jews more than it loves its own people.
No, that's not why. Hamas doesn't exist if Israel is not expropriating that land.
And there's plenty.
Then that's the catch. Hamas is not primary.
You believe?
Yes, I believe Hamas is not primary.
That there is not a terrorist organization, if there is a Palestine, that there is not a terrorist organization in that region that's attacking Jews, because I can tell you that the Jews aren't appropriating Iran's land.
Well, but what adds to the complication is that it seems like Israel created Hamas. Israel helped to fund Hamas during its early days because they wanted a competitor to the PLO, effectively.
Well, we've done similar things in our country, so
we do. Yeah, I this stuff is messy because everybody tries to get their fingers in every single pie that exists out there for the grabbing.
Right.
But you know what? Let's go to a break. Let's go to a break, do a brief pattern interrupt, and come back on the other side with our guest, Carmine Sabia. Great conversation. Carmine Sabia, for those listening, is a Christian conservative pundit, writer, and editor. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Every day we ask questions.
How is Facebook going to prevent suicides?
Well, do you see this as being a human rights violation?
Are the cows really stinking up the planet that much?
To move ideas forward.
A gravitational wave is a ripple in the fabric of space and time.
I don't think the launch of the satellite proves anything at all.
Where do good ideas come from? We connect with independent thinkers, hear their ideas, and create stimulating debates on real issues.
The Dow is in a correction. As I said, commodities across the globe are collapsing. Why is that the case? Because we are in a global recession.
That is set to change because Iran has approximately about 50 million barrels, which it had put in storage during the height of the sanctions regime, and that's ready to be released as soon as possible.
Where is the money?
The super rich individuals and the world's biggest companies are able to hide money in tax havens.
Is there a solution to the crisis?
No, because I don't think anything useful has come out of any of the policy reform discussions with respect to financial reform.
They give us answers we aren't always prepared for.
What are the chances that the report would make the Israeli authorities to review their policies towards the Palestinians?
Oh, probably zero.
This recession will be even worse than it was in 2008.
But that would be the nasty way for it to happen, you know. But because of Guantanamo, the U.S. is no longer taking so many prisoners, so instead of taking prisoners, they kill people.
A lot of people think that he's now unelectable and a bad leader.
Wow, that's just so much information to take in.
Pay attention, there'll be a test on this later.
Taking notes.
Welcome to the show.
Wow. This is crazy. We're definitely talking sci-fi over here. From 20 years ago, people would never have believed this. Crazy times we're living in.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this story. This is a fantastic story.
Yes, it is a fantastic story, and it's a worldwide problem.
Welcome to the party.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So yesterday we've had the January 6th commission that basically we found out that Kevin McCarthy does not back. And in fact, it's somewhat mixed in regards to the number of Republicans that do back a commission to figure out what occurred on January 6th. I kind of want to have a conversation about this, and we have a perfect guest to get into it. We have Carmine Sabia. He's a Christian conservative pundit, writer, and editor. Carmine, again, thank you for continuing to join us.
It's a pleasure.
Carmine, why doesn't Kevin McCarthy back January 6th, a commission to figure out what occurred on January 6th?
So I can't get into Kevin McCarthy's head and give you that answer. Here's my position. I would support a commission on that. If we could also support a commission on these cities that have been overrun by Antifa and the Democrat mayor's involvement in them, I think that both are needed, both are necessary, and both should be done. That being said, I have no problem starting with January 6th because what happened on January 6th, I'm a Trump Republican, but what happened on January 6th was an embarrassment to our country and dangerous. And frankly, if I don't believe there were representatives involved, I pray there weren't representatives involved, but if there were, that's something we need to know. So I don't think it's a witch hunt.
Well, is it a witch hunt if you can't use it against Trump? If you can't use, you can use this against Trump, to be clear. Theoretically, maybe the reason they're not going for the Antifa one is that they can't use it against Trump. But
absolutely,
it seems warranted by this is the thing, and so it can be both true that it's politicized and it was it's being pushed for political reasons because Trump is still a contender. But of course, you can also make the point that there's some merit there. I'm pretty much the same way, to be honest. I can't get inside Kevin McCarthy's mind either. But
as long as it's bipartisan, really bipartisan, not we have Liz Cheney and Adam Kissinger, so it's bipartisan. No, really bipartisan. Then I'm for it. If it's not a witch hunt, if it's not we're going to use this as a hammer for Trump kind of thing, if it's really real, that's the thing with so much stuff in D.C. It's not really real.
But isn't it going to miss
really real?
Isn't it going to miss the ball in some respect? Because there's no result of an investigation they're doing like this that can successfully diagnose meaningfully the real problems that led to January 6th. What it's going to be doing is looking at who's criminally responsible, who's responsible in a legal sense, and what specifically happened, and who we can charge with it effectively.
I personally would like to know if there were any actual elected officials involved, because that's very dangerous if that's the case, because that's an attempted coup, and that is something that we would have to know. That being said, my question to our friends on the left is, and I think it's a good question. Nobody from CNN ever answers me, which is funny because Jake Tapper will answer me all the time until I ask this question. He does. He'll answer me on Twitter all the time. Brian Stelter asks me all the time until I ask this question, which is, why is January 6th the only riot you care about? And why are the only police officers you seem to support the ones that got injured on January 6th? Because all I hear on CNN is anti-police stuff and, the Antifa, mostly peaceful protest, Well, this was mostly peaceful. By any stretch, the number of people that were there was mostly peaceful.
It was mostly peaceful until it raided the Capitol and attacked a lot of police officers and put hundreds of them in a hospital.
If we're going by the number of people, it was as mostly peaceful as
I don't know the fraction, but I hear the argument you're making, and I could buy it. I don't know. Jamarl, what's your take?
I think it was mostly peaceful up until the point where the people raided the Capitol and all of those cops got it. I mean, look, how can you have cops out there fighting, fist fighting, and it'd be mostly peaceful?
Was the George Floyd protests mostly peaceful?
90-something%, yes.
Okay, well, 90-something% of this was mostly
that seems pretty fair to me.
I guess the difference is one was raided the Capitol, based over, this idea that Trump was cheated, and the other one did so out of anger of a real crime.
And what the other one had was the long-term occupation of several city blocks. For weeks, months, in some cases in Seattle.
Well, yeah, in Seattle, a very long time. Yes.
And I think it's pretty evident that elected officials were involved.
Look, I have no issue with an investigation into, the stuff that took place over the course of the last year in regards to the protests. Zero. None at all. Especially because the thing that they need to ascertain, though, is why. Like, for the standpoint of the January 6th putsch, I get that. Was there anybody involved in that process? Was there, the leaders?
Here's the problem. If me, you, and Shane were making this decision, we'd have it done by the afternoon. I
guess what I'm asking you is, what are you trying to ascertain from the protests over the course of the year? Because for January 6th, I know what I'm trying to get.
I think you need to know if a place like Chaz was actively helped along by the Portland mayor. I'm not by the Seattle mayor.
See, I kind of doubt that.
I don't know why he would do that.
It seems to be that it was pretty encouraged, that police were pulled back from it.
I think it was hesitantly tolerated because they
take it over.
Kill somebody.
Yeah, I think it was tolerated because they didn't want to. They're like, okay, this is another quasi-Occupy in its own way. They're doing this little thing. Okay, let's try to keep it relatively safe. I don't, if there had been strong police pushback, well, in a protest against police pushback, if you have strong police pushback, that only inflames things. And so this was the crux that, police departments across the country were left in last summer is, okay, how do we respond to these things? They're protesting against us and against us being violent. So if they get violent, what do we do? And the answer in a lot of cases was to get violent, but in plenty of others was just kind of confusion where you remember the cops dancing, with the protesters, like getting into the Black Lives Matter support dance thing, and then some of the same people who were dancing there were later ID'd in photos at the breach of the Capitol on January 6th.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really?
My point is the world gone crazy. I don't know how to explain it, but that was part of the problem, Carmine. But I don't necessarily buy this.
But
the
didn't happen in
mayor.
Republican cities. Didn't happen in Republican cities.
What do you mean? It didn't happen that the protesters and stuff like that? I mean, but what would they gain out of that? What would the mayor get out of supporting a balkanization of the city?
I don't know if it's a gain so much as a fear.
Oh, you think the mayor was just scared of the protesters?
Well, yeah, but if
a political fear of the backlash.
Yeah,
they're in very liberal cities.
Not a literal physical fear, but it might politically be the parallel to banks boarding up their windows and painting Black Lives Matter on the inside to show of solidarity / concert pass or something.
Really helped them, by the way.
Well, it did. I still see some of that. I was curious. This is more personal, but moved back to DC recently. I was curious what it would be like in the city. So yes, A, Lafayette Square still blocked off in front of the White House, but B, I still do see residual signs of last summer's protests with a couple boarded up businesses. There's a dispensary that I saw that was boarded up fully and open for business, but to get inside the business, you need to also first open a completely boarded over door. And I know this for reasons I can't talk about on the radio. But my point.
Issue.
What's up, Carmine?
My issue, man, is that January 6th. Call it what you want to call it. I support an investigation, but it has been used. I mean, they're holding on to this like the roses hold on to the rain. It's a political hammer. It's a political hammer. We all know it. They don't let Don Lemon every night, with tears in his eyes for the police. Where are those tears every other night for the police, Don? Only the ones on January 6th count.
It's true.
Only the ones you can use as a political weapon count. So I think Republicans would be more receptive to this if it wasn't so blatantly obvious that it's being used as a political weapon. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair to me. Jamarl?
I think that's fair. I mean, I think part of it, too, is this kind of allegiance to Trump. I mean, if you're looking at the Cheney stuff, what is your take on the Cheney stuff, by the way? I don't think we had the opportunity to ask you about this.
Sure.
Where we have basically Liz Cheney voting with Trump 90% of the time, and yet being uncertain, and being escorted out. So what is it if it's not
I've been a Liz Cheney
policy?
Supporter. You can be anti-Trump all you want. I have no problem with anti-Trump people in the party. Here's what I have a problem with. And this is why Liz Cheney got the boot and why I like the fact that she got the boot. She couldn't shut up. The election's over, Liz. It's over. She took it on her shoulders, said, I'm going to fight Trump every day, and CNN's going to love me, and they're going to pat me on the back, and I'm going to... That's not going to help you get elected in Wyoming, Liz.
But does that have more to do with her pushing back on this idea that Trump actually won? Meaning Trump is still screaming that he won the race.
It has to do with the fact that nobody gave a rat's behind about Liz Cheney until she started speaking about Trump. Then all of a sudden cameras were in her face every day, and she got drunk on that. That's what happened. That's what happened.
To be serious, I feel like there might be something else going on here that is a little bit more complicated and intelligent, but maybe this is just a phantom of my imagination. But but here's the thing: it could be the case that Liz Cheney is trying to create some alternative. There's a word that I'm struggling to find, but some alternative to the status quo in the Republican Party right now. What was that, Carmine?
An alternative reality. Look, the ship has sailed.
Well, but she's trying to create a reserve in case Trumpism goes bust. One way of doing this is you try to create a sort of a live undercurrent of dissent or something like that, running parallel with the Republican Party that can reassert itself if Trump goes out. What's your take on that?
Well, you notice how so many people are against the squad, or the squad is against a lot of the things Pelosi does or even Biden does, and they'll say it once. Joe Biden, you're complicit in what's going on in Israel, and then they shut up. Liz Cheney has created a problem because her whole existence now is based on I hate Trump. You know who is a good friend of mine? Meghan McCain. And I talk to her all the time. And she's no fan of Donald Trump. But when she goes on TV, if Trump is mentioned, she'll give her thoughts. But she talks about other Republican policies and things. Liz Cheney, every time she goes, Trump, January 6th, Trump. We got tired of it. It was like, Liz, we understand how you feel. You put it on the record. Now shut up. But she couldn't do that.
But it is pretty pivotal.
It was a distraction to the party and distraction to the mission.
But it's a pretty damn pivotal thing. I mean, it's okay. Who's going to lead the party? That's like, I don't know. Other than
ship has sailed, my friend.
What's up? Oh, that
ship has sailed.
Yeah, but I guess if she's going to go out on a limb and die for that cause, then that's the way that she announces her temporary resignation from, this round of politics, whatever.
My good friend Joe Walsh. You guys know who Joe Walsh is?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. My good friend Joe Walsh. I said to him the other day, I said, Joe, you tell me you're still conservative values, this and that. I said, but look who comments on your Twitter posts. Look who comments on the Lincoln Project's Twitter post. It is not Republicans praising you and patting you on the back. It's Democrats, because you're tearing apart the party. And they love that.
That's true.
I don't see any Republicans on your Twitter feed going, you're right, sir. I don't see that. It's all liberals, but this is not your audience. They don't believe in what you believe in, but they love you right now because you're doing their dirty work. And so the Lincoln Project, I think, are straight grifters. Joe, on the other hand, he's a believer, and he gave up a lot to he didn't get rich at all. He gave up a lot to go out on a limb.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's a big difference. The Lincoln Project got rich on this, and I think they're straight grifters.
And they've gone up in flames, and as far as I can tell, at least, they kind of lost their significance, of course, as Trump exited anyway, and then right on time, I forget their founder's name,
article or something.
But the articles. What'd you say, Carmine?
Rick Wilson.
Yeah, and all the scrutiny of the grooming of young men that would take you under.
Well, they're the swamp. They're the swamp. And so many of these guys are the swamp, by the way, even on the Trumpism side. If McCarthy thought that Trump was, the party and the people were moving away from Trump, McCarthy threw Trump under the bus.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with loyalty to the man. But the party has to change. The party has to change. And Trump changed the party. And it's not because we're a cult of Trump and we love Trump. It's what Trump was saying. We felt, and you could go back, Shane, ask your dad. You could go back a long time with Republicans saying, you guys, Republicans and Democrats, you are two sides of the same coin, and we're tired of it.
Yeah, rhinos, all
and
that.
That's what Trump said.
That's what obviously Steve Bannon, being the chairman of his campaign after Manafort, is no coincidence, because Bannon, of course, took over Breitbart from Andrew Breitbart, and the alt-right, even though it has this sort of white supremacist tinge to it or whatever that was put on after a lot of its use, after a lot of folks were using it as an identifying label, that like criticism of the right wing, of rhinos and this one party union, there's a lot for the left and the right in their own ways, the progressive left and that vein of right to agree on. Carmine.
Hey, Shane.
Carmine.
Republicans accused of racism, film at 11.
Wait, say that again?
Republicans accused of racism, film at 11. I mean, that's been, come on, man. I get called a white supremacist every day.
I know, I hear you, but there was literally the thing with Richard Spencer and the alt-right, and it's just, my point is it was confusing. I remember, because when my dad worked for Breitbart, I remember at one point, I would work with him sometimes. We'd work together on his journalism. At one point, it had been a while since we'd seen each other, and I was like, okay, so what's the alt-right? And but when I asked him that question, it had not yet become a well-known white supremacist thing. I forget who it was. It might have been Vice or somebody. We need to close, Carmine. But somebody came out with an article basically making that connection, making that a big thing. Nobody who had been using it had been using it that way. What's up?
I don't even know what the alt-right is.
I hear you.
What's the alt-right? I don't know.
No, but more or less the group of people in the alternative of the right wing, whether they're fascists or whether they're regular people, quasi-libertarians, whatever, just people with different religious conservative convictions, all these different ways. Carmine, you got to close. I'm going to close it out here. Carmine Sabia, thank you for joining us this morning. Good conversation. Good talking. And for those listening, that was Carmine Sabia, writer and editor at large at SabiaReport.com. You can follow Carmine on Twitter at Carmine Sabia. Watch the Carmine Sabia show by going to SabiaReport.com and subscribe to his feed on Rockfin.com/Sabia Report. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break and we'll be coming back in a minute, taking your calls and closing today's show out. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Do call in. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are asking you to enjoy your God-given right to call into this talk show. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, 202-521-1320. Jamarl and I were just talking about the God-given right argument with Israel that we got into, that conversation with Carmine Sabia. You can call in about that or anything else that you'd like to. 202-521-1320 is the number. Yeah, Jamarl.
Yeah, God gave me stuff.
That argument gave you stuff.
God gave me that.
Well, God gave you that.
God
I thought you meant that argument gave me stuff.
Oh, no. That argument gave me stuff.
That could mean so many things, but I think I understand what you would mean by that. But
yeah, God gave me this. God gave me that. Yeah, that's an aggravating argument. I mean, that doesn't really get you anywhere. God gave. If you've noticed, when I try to come up with arguments for stuff, there's an ideological basis for the argument and me believing that people should have access to things. That's ideology, right? I believe that this person should have that, and I believe that worth more than the person having $1 billion, et cetera, et cetera. Those become ideological beliefs. An individual could say, I just want to have my ends met. I don't care if anybody else has their ends met. And that could be where they are. Whether I say the person is good, bad, right, wrong is entirely dependent upon from my own framing of things. So I can't fault an individual for basically saying that my concern is that I think Israel should be able to take whatever they want and everybody else can, eat dirt as far as I care. I don't care what are the consequences of that and everything. You can take that case. But the problem is the other person can argue the opposite of that. and say, well, God said that Israel doesn't supposed to get that land. And God gave me really good authority. How about, like, that doesn't really get you anywhere. This conversation, this argument is really about land. And whether you want to say God gave me that land from somebody else, or whether you want to say that land is mine, it's still about land and adding the God element into it. That's what I say. God says he dislikes your sexual persuasion. God says there's all sorts of stuff you can add God in on, and, in this kind of human experience. Doesn't really get you anywhere. And, for me, from the argument standpoint, I give it no ground. I mean, there has to be something more than this mythical being gave me this. That doesn't fly.
I hear you. We got calls. I could respond to that, and I don't know exactly what my response would be. I'd have to come up with one because I don't have an opinion on that exactly. Simply because, I mean, I do. I've got plenty of them, but I don't have a decided one. So I'm just going to go to our caller instead of entertain my nonsense. Let's go to Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, how's it going, guys? Really enjoyed the segment earlier. Speaking about the unemployment, obviously, I have some affinity for that one. But
you're talking about with Mark Frost, right?
Frost, yeah.
Yeah. Mark is awesome. Mark's pretty awesome. That was a good conversation because a lot of people are talking about COVID, so much about COVID, but I feel like the portion of the people that are falling through the cracks, and those numbers seem to only be brought up sometimes. Obviously, this show brings it up more than most, but still. But I'm calling in about the Carmine Sapia. God gave me that argument point. It's ridiculous from so many different directions, right? Because one, if you believe in God, right, whether Christian God, rabbit hole God, ant God, whatever God, if you believe in God, right, on some level, one would have to believe that God would have to agree that God created the entirety of the universe, all of life. So God created all of life, right, but decided out of all of life and all of the universe, all of the species just on this earth that we have not discovered yet, God decided that this one particular group is better than all and above all, and because that one particular group has God, who is the ultimate being, but somehow still can be referred to as a man, and have traits of a human being, God so loved that particular group that God, who is of peace and of fair, and whose son was most likely a socialist by the day's turns, right? Would decide to say, well, you know what, I don't like the murder, the slaughter, the killing, the unfairness on all these other things, but these guys are like a lot, even more than my graves. I like these guys more than my graves, so I'm going to let these guys just slaughter people and say that's okay and do that in my name.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. It's a ridiculous argument. It doesn't speak well for the truth of their belief, of their belief and what they say they believe in, so I just take it as hyperbole.
I hear you. No, and there's a huge amount to push back on it, but I don't take it as hyperbole. I think that's literally what they think. I think that I don't think that he was being dishonest or.
Consider that though.
What's up?
Consider that they think that. Consider that these people are in charge, right? Not Carmine, obviously, right? But this is a conservative, conservative Republican position, right? The foundation of it, right? Those people who believe that, are willing to believe that, are in charge.
Well, it's easy to it's a lot easier to believe a ridiculous belief, or at least an unfounded one, when you have other reasons for believing it too. And if you simultaneously believe that Israel is a useful ally, and that it helps to deal with the legacy of the Holocaust, and it just gives us a little bit more control in the region, then it kind of helps to justify a lot of the other stuff. Plus, if you believe in like different civilizations, and if you get neoconservative with it, or Samuel Huntingtonian with it, or whatever, and you start to believe that this is an opportunity to advance Western civilization in the Middle East, which is, of course, through democracy, one of the arguments that people make for it. You can come at this from different angles, but it makes it a lot easier to justify it from the I believe in it because God told me they should have it, that rule, which I will admit, I will still say, I don't know exactly where you land on that, because, okay.
No, you don't land on that.
Yeah.
It's not real.
Yeah.
It's not real.
But this is where I go to Jamarl's argument, though. But what else is, what is real? Is my right to that land because my father was born there real? Are you saying that religion is because I'm not religious, but Brave, go for it.
I would say there are some very tangible things, and you could slaughter a person's argument in a debate just by introducing that. Because if you say that you believe in God, you say that you are a true Christian. I was raised Baptist, right? And both of my parents were preachers, right? So if you say that you believe in these things and you have certain convictions, that you have a certain sense of moral right and wrong, right? This is the problem with religion, because religion. So that's. I mean, don't get me wrong. We all have. I have a spiritual foundation. I have a spiritual belief, and I lean religiously because I was raised Baptist. But at the same time, when as you challenged him in that conversation you guys had, when you start dissecting it, it falls apart because it was man-made.
Agreed, if I'm being honest, Brave, so do so many of the other of the political agglomeration things. I guess my point is, it does seem outlandish to me. But if it has play, then it's going to have play, and they're going to use it that way. And really, what it comes down to is whether it can sustain itself in the face of active scrutiny. And it might not, as power shifts in the Middle East. Anyway, we got to close this out. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back tomorrow morning. Have a great day, folks. Signing off.